Chapter 89. A simple mission. Klein nodded and said, "All right, but I still don't know what my mission is." "Nothing dangerous." "I haven't seen any signs of danger at the very least," Dunn emphasized. "This is a case which was referred to us by Golden Indus's police department. The famous philanthropist Sir Deweyville has been experiencing unusual harassment over the past month. Be it his bodyguards, the security guards he has employed, or the police, none of them have been able to find the culprit. Inspector Tolley, who is in charge of this case, suspects that it involves beyonder powers and thus handed the case over to us. I saw Sir Deweyville at the library the other day and noticed that he was feeling down and lethargic. So it was a result of being harassed." Klein knitted his brows and asked, "What kind of harassment is it?" "There hasn't been any physical harm inflicted yet, thus, the harassment wouldn't be considered dangerous. Sir Deweyville hears moans and cries every night, no matter where he is, be it Tingen or not. This has affected his sleep quality negatively." Dunn flipped the notes in his hands. "He has seen a psychiatrist and has asked his butlers and servants to confirm that it was not an illusion. Having confirmed that it isn't a hallucination, thus, it is suspected that someone is harassing him." Closing the file, Dunn looked up at Klein. "Change into your probationary inspector uniform in the break room, then meet Inspector Tolley, who is in charge of this case at the shooting club. He'll provide you with more details." "Probationary inspector uniform?" Klein asked instinctively. Dunn rubbed his forehead and smiled. "Half of our salary comes from the police department, and the title of probationary inspector doesn't merely belong in the records. When you met Leonard and I for the first time, we were also wearing uniforms. This is a perk held by fully official members." "Yes, the perks, as Emperor Roselle would call it. Unfortunately, I can't wear it as a casual outfit. Otherwise, I'd be able to have another spare outfit when my clothes are being washed." Klein picked up his cane and bade farewell before leaving the captain's office. He headed toward the break room and saw a black and white checkered uniform, complete with leather boots, placed on the table. The uniform's peak cap was embroidered with the logo of the police department, 2 crossed swords and a crown. Located on the shoulder was a black and white epaulet with a shimmering silver star. "This is a probationary inspector uniform?" Klein glanced at the uniform and noticed a string of numbers under the silver stars, 06-254. He had some understanding of the police rank structure in the Lone Kingdom. He knew that those at the top were the minister and the chief secretary of the police force. Under them were the respective commissioners, deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners of the various police departments. Those in the middle were superintendents and inspectors, while those at the very bottom were the sergeants and constables. After closing the door, Klein took off his suit and hat before changing into the uniform. He hung his suit up and left the room. He made his way into the clerk's office and looked at himself using the full-body mirror that Rosen brought to him. The young man in the mirror had black hair with gentle brown eyes. The uniform on his body accentuated him with a heroic spirit. Not bad. Klein praised himself narcissistically. He left his cane in the office and left the Blackthorn Security Company. Inside his pockets were a full set of equipment, ranging from weapons to his police badge. At the hall of the shooting club, Klein met Inspector Tolley immediately since he was the only one in a police uniform. "Of course, there's me too," Klein thought. There were 2 silver stars on the epaulets of Inspector Tolley's uniform. His clothes were propped up by his stomach and he had a thick blonde mustache. His frame was tall but not imposing. Perhaps, it was imposing in the past. "Moretti? Klein Moretti?" Inspector Tolley noticed Klein and welcomed him with a smile. "Hello, Inspector Tolley, I believe that you have the right person," Klein replied amicably, then following his memories, he raised his right arm, kept his fingers straight and tight before saluting. Tolley chuckled. "I can tell that you'll be a young man who's easy to get along with." "That's good. Shall we head to Sir Deweyville's place now?" Even though he was a higher rank than Klein, the tone in his query was obviously friendly. "No problem." Klein thought for a moment before he said, "You can fill me in on the details of the case on the carriage?" "Sure." Tolley stroked his thick blonde beard and guided Klein out of the shooting club. They boarded a carriage which was stopped on the other side of the road. There was the two crossed swords and a crown police emblem on the carriage, and it came with a personal carriage driver. Sir Deweyville is a believer of the goddess, so we referred the case to you, Tolley said quickly as he sat down. I know. The fine knight is a common figure on the covers of newspapers and magazines. Klein flashed a friendly smile. Tolley picked up the document docket beside him and removed the seal before taking out the materials inside. As he flipped through them, he explained, regardless, even if you are aware of it, I need to provide you with a detailed briefing. Sir Deweyville is one of the richest tycoons of Tinjin City. He built his career beginning with a lead and porcelain factory. It has now expanded to steel, coal, shipping, banking, and bonds. He is also a great philanthropist that has been praised by the king, having set up the Deweyville Charity Foundation, the Deweyville Trust, and the Deweyville Library. He was also knighted 5 years ago. If he were willing to run for mayor, I don't think anyone in Tinjin City could contest with him. But Backlund is his goal. He wants to become a member of parliament. We once suspected that the harassment might be related to this, but we have no clues to this date. Klein nodded slightly and said, we can't rule out that possibility, but there's nothing to confirm that suspicion as of now. Tolley didn't dwell on this point. He continued, from the 6th of last month, Sir Deweyville has heard painful skin-numbing moans every night when he sleeps, akin to a patient's fight for his life. He has checked the surrounding rooms multiple times, but he hasn't found anything unusual. His butler and servants have also confirmed that they heard such sounds, but it is simply softer for them. In the beginning, Sir Deweyville believed that this matter would pass quickly and didn't pay too much attention to it. But the moans became more and more frequent, to the point of occasionally happening during the day. There was even the addition of heart-wrenching cries. This has made Sir Deweyville lose sleep. Time and time again he had no choice but to leave Tinjin to his villa in the villages. But it was to no avail. The moans and cries persisted. Similarly, the phenomenon persisted even in Backlund, just that it wasn't as serious. He employed security guards to check his surroundings, but they didn't find any clues. Our preliminary investigations also came up with nothing. Sir Deweyville, who has been tortured for more than a month, is on the brink of collapse. He visited psychiatrists time and time again but was unable to have his problems resolved. He told us that if this problem was not solved within a month, he would leave Tinjin and head to Backlund. He believes that there would be people who can help him there. After listening to Tolley's explanation, Klein quickly analyzed and came up with a few possibilities. He offended a beyonder and is suffering from a curse? No, if he was suffering from a curse, the butlers and servants in his house wouldn't hear the same things. There's a beyonder with unknown motives hidden among his servants and bodyguards? But the problem stems from the point that there has been no requests made of Sir Deweyville over the past month. Perhaps Sir Deweyville accidentally came into contact with some vengeful evil spirit? That possibility cannot be ruled out. The carriage entered the Golden Indus Borough while Klein was still deep in thought. It stopped at the door of Sir Deweyville's house. A steel fence surrounded a lush garden. There were 2 statues by the side of the hollowed metal gates, a magnificent fountain that showered a marble sculpture with water, an expansive 2-story building, as well as a path wide enough to fit 3 carriages. Even the knight's house is only 2 stories high. The newspaper reported that Backlund is experimenting with building 10-story apartments. Klein got off the carriage and saw a sergeant with 3 chevron stripes walking over briskly. He looked at Klein and saluted. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning." Klein nodded with a smile. Tolley smiled. "This is Sergeant Gate. You can tell him if you need anything. This is Probationary Inspector Moretti, a history and psychological expert from the police department." Tolley introduced Klein to Gate. "I don't deserve such a title." Klein felt a little embarrassed. After the greetings, Gate pointed to the 2-story building behind the fountain and said, "Sir Deweyville is waiting for us." "All right." Klein caressed the revolver at his waist. That was his best bet against an enemy. Since he was in police uniform, he could put his revolver in a holster at his hip, making it easier to draw it. As they spoke, the trio made their way down the path, around the fountain, and arrived outside the door. By then, the door was already opened by a servant who was waiting politely at the side. As Klein pretended to adjust his hat, He tapped twice on his glabella to activate his spirit vision before entering the house. The square-faced Sir Deweyville was massaging his forehead in the hall. He was clearly in low spirits. His blonde hair and blue eyes were either dry or dull, as though he had aged considerably by at least 5 years. "Good morning, Sir Deweyville." Klein, Tolley, and Gate bowed at the same time. Sir Deweyville stood up and forced out a smile. "Good morning, officers. I hope that you can resolve what has been causing me distress." At that moment, Klein squinted and slightly knitted his brows. Other than his low spirits, Klein couldn't find any other problems with Sir Deweyville. He thought for a moment before he said, "Sir, in which room did you first hear the moans?" "My bedroom." Sir Deweyville shook his head. "Can we take a look?" inquired Klein. "Haven't you checked it many times?" the middle-aged butler interrupted from the side. It was clear that he didn't notice that Klein was the partner of the kind-hearted soul that had not pocketed the money that he picked up. Klein smiled, composed. "Those were my colleagues, not me." "Sir, this is an expert sent by the police agency," Tolley said, taking the opportunity to introduce him. Deweyville looked at the young expert and said, "All right, Cullen, take him to my room." "Sir, I hope that you will come with us," Klein said seriously. Deweyville hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "If that can solve the problem." He grabbed his cane as he spoke. He made his way feebly toward the staircase with the butler Cullen and several guards beside him, ready to support him if needed. Klein surveyed the surroundings as he followed behind them silently. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. They arrived at the 2nd story and entered the master bedroom. Klein didn't have the time to survey the surroundings when the hair on his body stood on their ends. This was feedback from his spiritual perception. Chapter 90. Findings by sight. Sir Deweyville's bedroom was larger than the living room and dining room of Klein's house combined. It was partitioned into a place for a bed, a living space, a changing room, a bathroom, and a study desk and bookshelves. The furnishings were exquisite, and the details were extravagant. But to Klein, the light seemed dimmer and the temperature was several degrees colder than the outside. At the same time, he seemed to hear the sound of sobbing and moaning, as though one was putting up a last-ditch struggle. Klein was in a trance, and everything suddenly returned to normal. The sunlight shone brightly through the window and poured over the entire bedroom. The temperature was reasonable, neither too high nor low. The surrounding policemen, bodyguards, and butler were quiet. No one spoke. He looked sideways at the classic yet luxurious bed. He felt there were pairs of blurry eyes lingering in the shadow, like the moths that fearlessly stayed around gas lamps. Taking a few steps closer, Klein lost the earlier images from his spirit vision. Not a standard wraith or an evil spirit. What is it exactly? Klein frowned and recalled the mysticism knowledge that he had been learning all this time. From what he had seen, the mission would have been easy if it was passed to a corpse collector, gravedigger, or spirit medium. It was obviously not within his domain of expertise. Holding back his urge to use divination as an investigative approach, Klein looked around slowly to look for other traces to confirm the few guesses on his mind. "Inspector?" Sir Deweyville hesitated and asked, "Did you discover anything?" "If it were that easy, I believe my colleagues wouldn't have waited until now," Klein replied, glancing at the philanthropist subconsciously. Just as he planned to retract his gaze, he suddenly saw that there was a faint white human figure reflected behind Sir Deweyville in the mirror behind him. No, there were many figures overlapping each other, resulting in a white distorted figure. The figure flashed by and Klein seemed to hear faint sobbing. Phew. He let out a breath to ease his nerves, having almost drawn his gun out of fright. Heightened spiritual perception with spirit vision will one day scare me senseless. Klein tried relaxing his tense nerves by joking around before redirecting his focus back onto Sir Deweyville. This time, he saw something different. Now that he was in the bedroom, Sir Deweyville had a faint and twisted figure shimmering around him. It even dimmed the lighting of that area. Every flash was accompanied by an illusionary cry and moan that could hardly be detected by an ordinary person. Hardly audible for an ordinary person under ordinary circumstances? Is it because it's daytime? Klein nodded as he thought. He had an initial judgment for this case. It was resentment that was haunting Sir Deweyville. It was the remnant spirituality that resulted from unresolved emotions before a human's death. If such feelings of resentment stayed in this world over a period of time, they would become a terrifying, wrathful spirit after becoming stronger. However, Sir Deweyville was a famous philanthropist. Even Benson, who was a picky person, was in awe of him. Why would he be bogged down with the resentment of the dead? Is he actually two-faced? Could it be the means of a beyonder with nefarious intentions? Klein guessed the possibilities suspiciously. After some thought, he looked towards Deweyville and asked, "Honorable sir, I have a few questions." "Please ask." Deweyville sat down wearily. Klein organized his thoughts and asked, "When you leave here to go to a new place, such as the village or backland, do you temporarily get at least half a night's worth of peace before the situation resumes and gradually worsens? Even when you sleep during the daytime, are you able to hear moaning and sobbing sounds?" Deweyville's half-closed eyes suddenly widened as his deep blue eyes were suddenly beaming with hope. "Yes. Did you find the root of the problem?" Only then did he realize that due to his extended period of insomnia and his poor mental state, he had completely forgotten to inform the police about such an important clue. Seeing that Klein's question had uncovered something useful, Inspector Tolley relaxed. He knew that the Nighthawk had found a clue. Sergeant Gate was surprised and curious too. He couldn't help but look closely at the psychological expert, Klein. It coincided with the traits of gradual entanglement and the feature of accumulation. Having received the feedback, Klein had basically confirmed the cause. Then he had two ways of helping Sir Deweyville to shake off the burden. One was to set up an altar directly around the man and remove the resentment of the dead entirely using ritualistic magic. The second option was to use other mysticism measures to find the root of the problem and solve it from there. Taking into consideration the rule of preventing commoners from learning of beyonder powers to the best of his abilities, Klein planned on first attempting the second method. Only if it failed would he pray to the goddess. "Sir, yours is a psychological illness, a mental problem." He spoke nonsense with absolute seriousness while looking at Deweyville. Sir Deweyville knitted his brows and asked in reply, "Are you telling me that I'm a mental patient, that I need to enter an asylum?" "No, nothing that serious. Actually, most people have psychological problems to one degree or another," Klein casually comforted him. "Please allow me to introduce myself again. I am a psychological expert from the Alwa County Police." Psychological expert? Deweyville and his butler looked at Inspector Tolley, who they were familiar with. Tolley nodded seriously and confirmed that it was true. "All right, what do you need of me for my treatment? Besides, I don't understand why my butler, my bodyguards, and my servants will hear the sobbing and moaning as well." Deweyville held his walking stick with both hands, looking confused. Klein replied professionally, "I will explain it to you after it's resolved. Please tell your butler, your servants, and your bodyguards to leave. Inspector Tolley, Sergeant Gate, please leave as well. I need a quiet environment to begin the initial treatment." "A treatment with magic?" Inspector Tolley added in his heart and nodded at Sir Deweyville. Deweyville fell silent for more than 10 seconds before saying, "Cullen, take them to the living room on the second floor." "Yes, sir." Butler Cullen didn't retort since the request was made by a police officer, a probationary inspector, and a psychological expert. After watching them leave the room one after another and closing the door behind them, Klein looked at Deweyville, who had dark blonde hair and blue eyes, and said, "Sir, please lie down on your bed. Relax and try to sleep." "All right." Deweyville hung his coat and hat on the clothes rack before walking slowly to the side of the bed and then laid down. Klein drew all the curtains, turning the room dark. He took off his pendant and quickly used spirit pendulum to determine any dangers. Then, he sat on the rocking chair near the end of the bed, traced a spherical light in his mind, and entered cogitation. He allowed the world of spirituality to extend before his eyes. Then he leaned against the back of the chair and fell into a deep sleep, allowing for his astral projection to make contact with the external world. He was using the technique of dream divination to let himself be in the spiritual environment like he was dreaming, so as to communicate with each and every resentment that plagued Sir Deweyville. Only communication would be able to give him an answer and solve the problem. Bush, bush. A sad sob reverberated in Klein's ear, and he saw that the white translucent figures were floating around him. A painful groan echoed as Klein, who barely regained his mental processes, extended his right hand and touched one of them. Suddenly, the figures swarmed at him like moths darting toward a fire. The image before Klein's eyes suddenly turned blurry and his brain seemed to be cleaved into two. Half of his mind was calmly observing while the other half saw a mirror. In the mirror, there was a young girl dressed in worker garbs. She looked strong and fit as she walked in a dust-covered factory while her head throbbed in pain. Her eyesight occasionally turned blurry and her body became skinnier by the day. She seemed to hear someone calling her Charlotte, and the voice said that she had a hysterical illness. Hysterical illness? She looked towards the mirror and saw that she had a faint blue line on her gum. The mirror's view switched and Klein saw another girl called Mary. She too walked into the lead factory, young and lively. Suddenly, half of her face started twitching, followed by her arm and leg on the same side. "You have epilepsy?" she heard someone say while her whole body was convulsing. As she twitched and fell, the intensity increased before she finally lost consciousness. There was another girl, and she was depressed. She was walking around the street in a daze, to the point of having a speech impediment. She had a very bad headache, and she had a blue line on her gums. She would also convulse from time to time. She met a doctor, and the doctor said, "Lafayette, this is a result of lead poisoning." The doctor looked at her with pity and saw her convulse again. She twitched continuously, and the doctor saw that her eyes had lost all their light. Many images appeared before Klein, and he remained immersed within them and calmly observed. Suddenly, he understood the plight of the girls. The female workers had been in extended contact with white lead. They had all died of lead poisoning as a result of long-term exposure to the dust and powder. Sir Deweyville had a lead factory under his name and also 2 porcelain factories. All of them hired comparatively cheaper female workers. Klein saw all of that in silence and felt that there was something that still had not been clarified. Such death resentment was insignificant. They could not affect reality or have any effect on Deweyville even when accumulated. Unless there was a more powerful and stubborn resentment that had united them all. Just then Heach saw another girl. The girl was no more than 18 years old, but she was glazing the porcelain in the factory. "Haley, how are you doing lately? Do you still have a headache? If it gets too serious, remember to inform me. Sir Deweyville has enforced a rule that people with severe headaches cannot continue being in contact with lead and must leave the factory," an elder lady asked with concern. Haley touched her forehead and replied with a smile, "Just a little, I'm okay." "Tell me tomorrow if it gets any worse," the elderly lady exhorted. Haley agreed. When she returned home, she massaged her forehead from time to time. She saw that her parents and brothers had returned, but their faces looked hopeless. "Your father and brothers lost their jobs," her mother said as she wiped her tears. Her father and brother hung their heads low and muttered, "We will try to get some work at the harbor. But we don't even have bread money for the day after tomorrow. Maybe we will need to move to Lower Street." Haley's mother looked at her with reddened eyes. "When are you getting your pay? It's 10 soldi, right?" Haley massaged her forehead again. "Yeah, Saturday." "Saturday." She didn't say anything else and remained as quiet as usual. She returned to the factory the next day and told her supervisor that her headache recovered and she felt fine. She smiled and walked 5 kilometers back and fro to work daily. She massaged her head more and more frequently. "You haven't found another job?" Haley couldn't help but ask her father and brother while looking at the soup which was boiling with black bread. Her father said in frustration, "The economy is in a recession. Many places are retrenching. Even the harbor jobs are sporadic. I could only get 3 soldi and 7 pence a week." Haley sighed and fell into her usual silence. However, she hid her left hand that was twitching suddenly. On the second day, she walked to work again. The sun was shining brightly, and the street grew busier and busier with pedestrians. Suddenly, she started convulsing all over. She fell to the side of the road, foam spewing out of her mouth. She looked up into the sky and her gaze turned into a blur. She saw people walking past and others getting close. She saw a carriage pass by with the Deweyville family emblem with a white dove with its spread wings as if ready to take off. She tried hard to open her mouth, but she couldn't make a sound. So, she didn't say a thing, quiet as ever. But the difference this time was that she was dead. Chapter 91. Solution. The scenery started to distort, turning illusory and began to fade away. After Klein left his dreamlike state, his vision adapted to the darkness in the room. He knew that with £1 and 10 soldi, which was 30 soldi a week, Benson didn't have an easy time supporting the family according to the standards of an average family. He had thought that the majority of workers earned 20 soldi a week. He had once heard Melissa remark that Lower Street of Ironcross Street had 5, 7, or even 10 families squeezing into the same room. He also learned from Benson that as a result of the situation in the southern continent, the kingdom's economy was in a recession for the past few months. He knew that a maid, with board and lodging provided, could earn between 3 soldi and 6 to 6 soldi a week. Klein extended his hand and pinched his glabella. He was silent for a long time, until Sir Deweyville asked, "Officer, aren't you going to say anything?" The psychiatrists I went to would always speak to me and ask questions in such a situation. However, I must say that I feel at peace. I almost fell asleep. I haven't heard any moans or cries yet. How did you do it? Klein leaned back in the rocking chair. Instead of providing an answer, he asked with a gentle tone, "Sir, do you know about lead poisoning? Do you know about the dangers of lead?" Deweyville fell silent for a few seconds. "I did not know about it in the past, but I do now. Are you telling me that my psychological illness stems from my guilt toward the female lead and porcelain factory workers?" Without waiting for Klein to answer, he continued just like he always had, in his position of power during a negotiation. "Yes, I did feel guilty about this in the past, but I did compensate them. At my lead and porcelain factories, the workers do not earn less than other workers in the same industry. In Backlund, lead and porcelain workers are paid no more than 8 soldi a week, but I pay them 10, sometimes even more. Many people criticize me for breaking ranks since it makes it hard for them to recruit workers. If not for the Grain Act that made many farmers bankrupt, sending them to the cities, they would have had to raise their wages just like I did. Furthermore, I've also informed the supervisor of the factories to make sure that those with repeated headaches and blurry vision are to leave the areas where they are exposed to lead. If their illness is really severe, then they can even ask for help at my charity foundation. I think I have done enough." Klein spoke without a ripple of emotion in his voice. "Sir, at times, you cannot imagine how important a salary is to a poor person. Simply losing work for a week or two can result in an irreversible loss to their family, a loss that would cause tremendous grief." He paused before saying, "I am curious, why wouldn't a kind person like you install equipment that can protect against dust and lead poisoning in your factories?" Deweyville looked at the ceiling and laughed ruefully. "That would make my costs too high for me to bear. I would no longer be able to compete with other lead and porcelain companies. I no longer pay too much attention to my profits in these areas of my business. In fact, I am even willing to fork out some money. But what's the point of keeping the business if I have to keep doing that? That can only help a number of workers and not become a standard in the industry or affect change on other factories. That would merely result in me forking out money to support the workers. I heard that some factories even secretly hire slaves to minimize costs." Klein crossed his hands and said after a moment of silence, "Sir, the root of your psychological illness comes from the buildup of guilt, despite you believing that the guilt has faded and disappeared over time. It wouldn't have any visible effects under normal circumstances, but there was something that triggered you and set off all the problems at once." "Something that triggered me? I'm not aware of such a thing," Deweyville said, puzzled, but with conviction. Klein allowed the chair to rock gently as he explained with a gentle tone, "You did fall asleep for a few minutes just now, and you told me something. Hypnosis." Deweyville made a guess as he usually did. Klein did not give a direct reply and instead said, "You once saw a girl dying on her way to work while you were on your carriage. She had died because of lead poisoning. She was one of your workers who glazed porcelain while she was still alive." Deweyville rubbed his temples, speechless before saying somewhat doubtful, "I think that happened once, but I can't remember it clearly. His prolonged insomnia had left him in a poor mental state. He could only faintly recall seeing such a scene. He thought for a moment, but gave up taxing his brain. Instead, he asked, "What was that worker's name?" "Well, what I meant was, what should I do to cure my psychological illness?" Klein replied immediately, "Two things. First, the worker that died by the side of the road was called Haley Walker. That was what you told me. She was the most direct trigger, so you have to find her parents and give them more compensation. Second, spread information about the dangers of lead in the newspapers and magazines. Allow your charity foundation to help more workers who suffered from the damage. If you succeed in becoming a member of parliament, push for enacting laws in this domain." Deweyville sat up slowly and laughed in a self-deprecating manner. "I will do all of the rest, but to enact a law, I think it's impossible since there is still competition from nations beyond our country. Setting up such a law would just slip the entire industry in the country into a crisis. Factories would become bankrupt one by one, and many workers would lose their jobs. Organizations that help the poor cannot save that many people." He slowly got off the bed and adjusted his collar. He then looked at Klein and said, "Haley Walker, right? I'll immediately get Cullen to retrieve information about her from the porcelain company and find her parents. Officer, please wait with me and continuously evaluate my mental state." "All right." Klein stood up slowly and smoothed his black and white checkered police uniform. At 11 in the morning in the living room of Deweyville, Klein sat on the sofa in silence as he looked at the man and woman being guided into the house by butler Cullen. The two guests had blemished skin, wrinkles already woven into their faces. The man had a slight hunch while the woman had a mole under her eyelid. They looked nearly identical to what Klein had seen through Haley, just older and more haggard. They were so skinny that they were almost all bone. Their clothes were old and ragged. Klein even learned that they couldn't continue living on Lower Street of Iron Cross Streets any further. So, Klein sensed an icy wind start to spiral through his spiritual perception. He pinched his glabella and shot a glance toward Sir Deweyville. It was unknown when a faint white, translucent, contorted figure had appeared behind him. Good morning, Honorable Sir." Haley's parents were unusually polite. Deweyville rubbed his forehead and asked, "Are the both of you Haley Walker's parents? Doesn't she also have a brother and a 2-year-old sister?" Haley's mother answered in fear, Her brother broke his leg at the harbor some time back. We got him to take care of his sister at home." Deweyville remained silent for a few seconds before he sighed. "My deepest condolences for what happened to Haley." Upon hearing that, the eyes of Haley's parents immediately turned red. They opened their mouths and said over each other, Thank you for your goodwill. The police told us that Haley died from lead poisoning. That's the term, right? Oh, my poor child, she was only 17. She was always so quiet, so determined. You had sent someone to visit her before and sponsored her burial. She is buried at the Raphael Cemetery." Deweyville glanced at Klein and changed his sitting posture. He leaned forward and said with a serious tone, "That was actually an oversight of ours. I have to apologize. I have considered that I need to compensate you, to compensate Haley. Her weekly salary was 10 soldi, was it not? 1 year would be 520 soldi, or £26. Let's assume that she could have worked for another 10 years. Cullen, give Haley's parents £300. £300? Haley's parents were dumbfounded. They never had more than £1 of savings, even at their richest. It wasn't only them who were dazed. Even the expressions of the bodyguards and maids in the room were also all that of shock and envy. Even Sergeant Gate couldn't help but draw in a deep breath. His weekly salary was only £2, and among his subordinates, only one chevroned constable earned £1 a week. Amidst the silence, Butler Cullen walked out of the study and held a bulging sack. He opened the sack and revealed stacks of cash, some £1, some £5, but mostly made up of 1 or 5 soldi. It was clear that Deweyville had made his subordinates receive change from the bank earlier. It's an expression of Sir Deweyville's goodwill. Cullen handed the sack over to Haley's parents after receiving confirmation from his master. Haley's parents took the sack and rubbed their eyes, looking at it in disbelief. No, this is too generous. We cannot accept this, they said as they held the sack tightly. Deweyville said in a deep voice, this is what Haley deserves. Why, you truly are a noble, charitable knight. Haley's parents bowed repeatedly in agitation. They had smiles on their faces, smiles that they couldn't repress. They praised the knight repeatedly, repeating the same few adjectives they knew. They kept insisting that Haley would be grateful towards him in heaven. Cullen, send them home. Oh, take them to the bank first. Deweyville heaved a sigh of relief and instructed his butler. Haley's parents hugged the sack tightly and walked toward the door quickly without stopping. Klein saw the faint translucent figure behind Sir Deweyville attempt to extend its hands towards them, hoping to leave with them, but the parents' smiles were abnormally radiant. They didn't turn back. That figure turned fainter and, soon, vanished completely. Klein also sensed that the icy feeling in the guest hall had instantly returned to normal. From beginning to end, all he did was sit there silently, not expressing his opinion. Officer, I feel much better. Now can you tell me why my butler, servants, and bodyguards could also hear the cries and moans? This shouldn't just be solely a psychological illness of mine, right? Deweyville looked at him curiously. Inspector Tolley, who knew the underlying truth, instantly became nervous. Klein replied without much expression, in psychology, we call this phenomenon mass hysteria. Chapter 92, Psychological Expert, Mass Hysteria? Sir Deweyville, who had met many psychiatrists recently, ruminated over the term Klein had said. Despite their curiosity, his butler, bodyguards, and servants didn't make a single sound since they had not been given permission by him. As for Sergeant Gate, he looked towards Klein doubtfully as if he had never heard of that concept. Klein controlled his habit of tapping the armrest with his fingertips and calmly explained, humans can be fooled easily by their sensory organs. Mass hysteria is a kind of psychogenic illness that is a result of tense nerves and other factors amongst a group of individuals as they influence each other. The jargon he spewed out confused Sir Deweyville, Sergeant Gate, and the rest, causing them to subconsciously opt to believe him. Let me give a simple example of this. This was one of the cases that I previously dealt with. One man held a dinner banquet and invited 35 guests. Midway, he suddenly felt disgusted and puked. After that, he even had severe diarrhea. After a couple times, he began to believe that he had gotten food poisoning. He shared his speculation with the other guests on the way to the hospital. In the next 2 hours, there were more than 30 guests that had diarrhea amongst the 35 guests, with 26 of them experiencing nausea. They flooded the entire emergency room of the hospital. The doctors went through a detailed examination and performed cross-checks, and they concluded that the very first man didn't have food poisoning at all. Instead, it was a result of stomach inflammation caused by the change of weather and cold liquor. The most surprising fact was that none of the guests who went to the hospital had food poisoning. In fact, not a single one of them was sick. That is mass hysteria. Deweyville nodded slightly and marveled, I understand now. Humans do lie to themselves easily. It's no wonder that Emperor Roselle once said that a lie would become reality once it was repeated 100 times. Officer, how may I address you? You are the most professional psychiatrist I have ever met. Inspector Moretti. Klein pointed at his epaulette and said, Sir, your troubles have been resolved temporarily for now. You can try to sleep now while I determine if there are any other problems. If you are able to sleep well, please allow us to bid farewell ahead of time instead of waiting for you to wake up. All right. Deweyville massaged his forehead, took his cane, and walked upstairs to his bedroom. Half an hour later, a police carriage left the fountain at the door of Deweyville's residence. When Sergeant Gate got off on the way and returned to his police station, Inspector Tolley looked towards Klein. He complimented in jest, even I believed that you were a real psychological expert. Before he finished his sentence, he saw the young man in a black and white checkered uniform looking expressionless. His eyes were deep and serene as he forced a smirk on his face and said, I only had some experience with it in the past. Inspector Tolley fell silent until the carriage arrived outside 36 Zutland Street. Thank you for your assistance, allowing Sir Deweyville to be finally free from his problems and be able to find sleep again. He extended his hand and shook Klein's hand. "Thank Dunn on my behalf." Klein nodded slightly and said, "All right." He went up the stairs and returned to the Blackthorn Security Company. He knocked and entered the captain's office. "Dunn." Dunn was waiting for his lunch. "Dunn." Klein massaged his forehead and kept his reply short and simple. The root of the problem stemmed from the lead and porcelain factory under Sir Deweyville. From the moment they were established to this day, too many deaths have been caused by lead poisoning. And every accident left Sir Deweyville with some resentful spirituality. Generally speaking, that wouldn't bring too big of a problem. That might cause nightmares at the most. Dunn had experienced similar cases with his plethora of experience. Klein nodded slightly and said, "Yes, that's usually the case." But, unfortunately, Sir Deweyville encountered a female worker who died of lead poisoning on the streets. She collapsed by the side of the street and happened to catch a glimpse of the Deweyville's family emblem. She also harbored intense indignation, worry, and desires. It was only when Sir Deweyville gave her parents, brother, and sister a compensation of £300 did her emotions dissipate. This is a societal problem. It isn't rare in the age of steam and machinery. Dunn took out his smoking pipe, smelled the tobacco, and sighed. Workers that make linen work in damp environments and are generally diagnosed with bronchitis and joint-related ailments. As for factories with serious powder and dust issues, even if the dust isn't poisonous, it can still accumulate into lung problems. So, we don't have to talk about this. As the kingdom develops, I believe these problems will be resolved. Klein, let's find a restaurant tonight to celebrate you becoming an official member, all right? Klein thought for a moment before saying, "How about tomorrow?" "Captain, I have used spirit vision for an extended period of time today and also used dream divination to directly interact with those resentments. I'm feeling especially drained. I want to return home in the afternoon to get some rest. Would that be okay?" "Oh, then I'll head over to the divination club at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon to see how the club members are reacting to news of Han S. Vincent's sudden death." "No problem, that's only necessary." Dunn chuckled. "Tomorrow night it is. Let's do it at Old Will's restaurant next door. I'll get Roseanne to make a reservation." Klein took off his police peak cap and stood up to salute him. "Thank you, Captain. See you tomorrow." Dunn lifted his hand and said, "Hold on, did you mention that Sir Deweyville gave the female worker's parents a compensation of £300? "Yes." Klein nodded and immediately understood the reason why the captain had mentioned it. "You are worried that they will get into trouble because of their wealth?" Dunn sighed. "I've seen many similar situations in the past. Pass me their address, I'll ask Kenley to arrange for them to leave Tingen for another city to start life anew." "All right," Klein replied in a deep voice. With all of that done, he left Dunn's office and entered the break room diagonally opposite. He changed into his original suit and left the police uniform in his locker. Klein took the public carriage back to Daffodil Street in silence. He took off his coat and top hat. He then heated up the leftovers from last night and ate them with the last piece of wheat bread to fill his stomach. Then he went to the second floor, hung his clothes, and slumped into bed. When he woke up, the pocket watch showed that it was already 2:10 in the afternoon. The sun was hanging high up in the sky and the sunlight shone through the clouds. Underneath the golden splendor, Klein stood next to his desk and looked out the oriel window. He watched the pedestrians in old ragged clothing as they entered or left Iron Cross Street. Phew. He let out a breath slowly, finally overcoming his low spirits. Every journey had to be taken one step at a time. Likewise, his sequence needed to be advanced one level at a time. Everything worked like that. He shook his head and sat down. He started concluding and reorganizing his encounter over the last week, so as to reinforce the important points in his mind to prevent himself from forgetting them. 5 minutes before 3 in the afternoon. Above a blurry, boundless, grayish-white, silent gray fog stood a lofty palace. An ancient mottled bronze table sat there quietly. On the seat of honor at the long table sat a man already engulfed by the thick gray fog. Klein leaned against the back of the chair and contemplated. He suddenly extended his hand and tapped on the crimson stars that represented justice and the hanged man. Backlund, Empress Borough. Audrey lifted her dress as she quickly walked towards her bedroom. Suddenly, she felt something and looked sideways at the shadow sitting on the balcony. As expected, she saw her golden retriever, Susie, who was sitting there in silence, observing her as always. Audrey sighed and drew a crimson moon on her chest. She then got closer and looked down at her golden retriever from a commanding position. Susie, that's not right. This is peeping. A spectator has to observe in an open manner. The golden retriever lifted its head to look at its owner and shook its tail. After nagging her dog, Audrey didn't delay any further and continued walking towards her bedroom again. In the few seconds of opening and closing the door, she suddenly had a weird idea. I wonder if Mr. Fool would allow Susie to enter that mysterious space. Then, there would be 4 members in the tarot gathering. And all of them would be Beyonders. No way, Susie can't talk. If they were to let her express her opinion and share her thoughts, what would she do? Woof woof woof? Howl howl? Why am I mimicking a dog's bark here? Just imagining such a scene feels really strange. A mysterious and solemn gathering with the sudden barking of a dog. Mr. Fool would definitely kick us out of the tarot gathering directly. Audrey locked the door and sat by the side of her bed. She took out a piece of old yellowish-brown paper from underneath her pillow. She read it repeatedly and entered her spectator state. In a particular area of the Sonia Sea, an old sailboat which was in pursuit of the listener had already left the Rorsted archipelago. Seafarer Alger Wilson was worried that the wall clock's machinery would malfunction, so he entered the captain's cabin about half an hour earlier in case he had misjudged the time, which would cause his subordinates to see him getting pulled into the tarot gathering. In front of him was a glass of nearly transparent liquor. The rich aroma swirled strand after strand into his nostrils. Alger trembled once again when he thought of the impending gathering, the boundless fog that presented itself in front of him in the hotel's corridor, and the mysterious fool who sat in the middle of the gray fog. He lifted his glass and took a gulp, using the burning sensation in his throat to ease the emotions that had stirred within him. Very soon he restored his calm. He was as calm and stoic as he always was. Chapter 93. New diary page. Above the gray fog, gigantic stone columns held up a majestic divine hall. 2 dark red blobs extended out into faint human figures by the side of the ancient mottled bronze table. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Augmented with a blurry effect, Audrey greeted him with a bow and smiled. It is unfortunate that there is no wine here. Otherwise, we could have a toast to your successful trial. She was referring to the ritualistic magic. You are more powerful than we imagined, Alger Wilson praised as well. Klein was surrounded by the thick fog as usual. He pressed down with his right arm and spoke with his normal tone, replying as though it was natural. Great, this means that we are on the path of excellence. If you have any matters to tend to that leave you unable to attend the gathering on Mondays, conduct the ritual and inform me. All you have to do is change the line in the incantation, I pray for a good dream, with the reason. All right, Audrey quickly agreed. Mr. Fool, I obtained another page of Emperor Roselle's diary. I believe I still owe you 1 page. I was away from land this week and haven't found any new pages. Alger placed his right hand near his chest and bowed in apology. No matter. I expected my request to take a long time. Klein leaned back into his chair and tapped the armrest with his index finger. He looked at Miss Justice and said, You can express the contents of the diary now. Audrey bowed slightly and said, As you wish. A pen suddenly appeared before her. She recalled the symbols that she had memorized and tried her best to transcribe them. In seconds, she saw that the goatskin was already filled with content. The strange symbols neatly covered the entire page. After checking the contents, she put down the fountain pen and said, It's done. Klein raised his hand and the goatskin parchment appeared in his palm. Shifting his gaze down, he started reading without emotion. July 9th. I suddenly thought of an interesting question. Since the sequence pathways are also called the blessings of the divinities or pathways of the divinities, then why would the stone slate that records the completed 22 sequence pathways be called the blasphemy slate? Blasphemy, what an interesting term. Just who is the one blasphemed? And who created the blasphemy slate? How could that person hold all of the sequence pathways? Just what other information was on the stone? I really want to see it. July 12th. I've realized another fact today. The sealed artifacts are an important component of a church's overall strength, even though some of the sealed items are very, very dangerous. Among the 7 churches, the God of Craftsmanship wields the least number of sealed artifacts, which are also relatively less dangerous. Did I join an organization without a future? No, I should think of it this way: only a blank piece of paper can produce a good painting. A weak organization is the best place for me to display my abilities. July 14th. I saw that mysterious Mr. Zaratul again. I never expected him to be the leader of an ancient organization, the Secret Order. Klein's pupils constricted when he read this. He nearly revealed an unnatural expression. The Zaratul family only had a certain connection with the Secret Order in the notes of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. But now, he learned from Emperor Roselle that the mysterious Mr. Zaratul was further determined to be the leader of the Secret Order. From the looks of it, it is an unquestionable fact that the Secret Order holds the seer sequence pathway. While Klein was reading the diary, Audrey looked over and began observing him out of habit. However, her field of vision was completely obscured by the thick fog. Momentarily taken aback, Audrey snapped back to her senses and turned her head frantically to look at the other illusory dark red star. I was too reckless, too insolent, too foolish in trying to observe Mr. Fool. I was lucky that he isn't angry. Audrey stuck out her tongue secretly and pretended to admire the scenery. She was just short of humming a lively tune. Alger sat silently, his gaze never leaving the long bronze table. He knew his place, as if he was in the presence of a true god. Klein collected himself and scanned the last portion of the diary. After learning that I had become a savant, Mr. Zaratul mentioned that I had chosen a difficult, yet relatively safe path. I asked him why that was the case, but all he did was smile before telling me that the sequence pathway contains secrets beyond my imagination. I couldn't help but ask him which sequence pathway he selected. He told me that his sequence 9 was seer. I intentionally mocked him and asked if every seer only disclosed half-truths, never explaining things more clearly. Furthermore, he was clearly a powerful high-sequence beyonder. There was no need for him to continue acting as a seer. Mr. Zaratul told me that it was a habit he adopted from back when he was a seer, and that this was a method that could pique my curiosity and make me cooperate with him. He hoped that I could help him steal a dangerous sealed item from the Church of the God of Craftsmanship, a relic of the Antigonus family. Clearly, this must wait until I become a core member of the Church of the God of Craftsmanship. I asked Mr. Zaratul how long it would take to digest the potion if I used the acting method, and what standards I should use to determine if I had digested it completely. He told me that for the lower sequences, it would only take half a year to digest the potion as long as one strictly used the acting method. In fact, in the fastest case, it might only take a month. And standard measure for progress was simple: every beyonder would sense it immediately once the potion was completely digested. It is what it is. I asked him for more details, but he merely smiled at me. To hell with his smiles, I'll beat up every seer I see when I become a high-sequence beyonder. Rest in peace, Emperor. Klein read the diary several times before looking at Justice and the Hanged Man again. Sorry for the wait. It is our honor. Audrey was still shocked, forgetting that she was a spectator. She looked at the Hanged Man and organized her words. Where can I find the psychology alchemists? Psychology alchemists. Klein suddenly recalled the man buying supplementary ingredients for the spectator potion at the Tingen underground market. Perhaps he was a member of the psychology alchemists? Just as Klein was considering how to get closer to that man, the Hanged Man, Alger Wilson, shook his head and said, Miss Justice, firstly, I don't have a clue. Secondly, I don't think there's any rush in seeking out the psychology alchemists. What you should focus on now is completely digesting the spectator potion. Audrey glanced at the fool and noticed that he didn't have any intention of adding to the conversation. She nodded in disappointment and said, All I want is to have plenty of time to prepare so that I can approach them more naturally. All right, then when can I digest the spectator potion and stop acting? Is there a standard that indicates when I can? I'm almost at the point where I no longer feel frustrated, nor do I hear the constant murmuring anymore. Alger looked at the fool in the fog but saw that he didn't have any intention of speaking. He then deliberated before saying, if you don't use the acting method, the typical rule of thumb is to wait 3 years and confirm that you no longer feel restless or receive any auditory or visual illusions. There is one simple test to determine when you can. That method is to exhaust your body to its limit. If you still don't hear any maniacal murmurings or see any strange things at that point, that would mean that you're ready to advance. With regards to the acting method, I have also just come into contact with it. It feels good, so I don't think it'll take 3 years. That wasn't useful at all. 3 years, that's too long. Audrey criticized inwardly. She had just thought about this when she heard an armrest being tapped. Audrey froze, then turned her head in joy. She saw the fool tapping on the edge of the long table. Alger sat straighter, waiting for the fool to speak. Klein said in his normal tone, 4 low-sequence beyonders, as long as you strictly stick to acting, you should be able to digest the medicine in half a year. It's even possible to do it in a month. He looked at Justice and added, as for the signs of digestion, you'll know it when it comes. It doesn't need to be taught. A month. Great. Thank you, Mr. Fool. Audrey exclaimed while brimming with joy. Miss Justice, don't think that you are the chosen one. The key point is half a year. Klein lifted his right hand and placed it beside his lips. Half a year, Alger repeated softly. Audrey sensed joy, relief, and intense doubt in his tone. What is he suspicious about? Audrey thought as she asked, Mr. Fool, have you considered adding more members? Klein leaned back casually. He had long prepared an answer. This started as a trial, so I didn't spend much time thinking about extending our meetings. But now, as a regular gathering, we must choose our members carefully. Secrecy is our motto. Audrey nodded gently and said, that is to say that we have to follow a process of observation, recommendation, and testing process. Yes, boss. You can interpret it that way, Klein affirmed. In his mind, he was thinking about how he could inquire about the secret order and the clown potion. How can I ask questions in a way that befits my status? Klein was placed in a difficult spot. At that moment, realizing that Justice temporarily had nothing else to say, Alger took the initiative to speak. I've heard that a listener from the Aurora Order is searching for traces of the true creator, which is the holy residence they advocate. True creator? Audrey asked, puzzled. It is an ancient entity worshipped by numerous secret organizations and cults. They believe that the creator hasn't completely perished. The core he left behind is the true creator. Alger gave a rough explanation. Since the 5th epoch, the true creator has appeared in many forms, such as the hanged giant or the eye behind the shadow curtains. Many people believe that Emperor Roselle referenced the imagery of the true creator when he was creating the tarot cards. Hence, there exists the card of the hanged man. At this point, he looked at Klein and said, Mr. Fool, there's nothing with what I said, right? Is he trying to probe for my views on the true creator? Klein thought about the bloody man on the cross that the captain saw in Han S. Vincent's dream and immediately had an idea. Doesn't both the hanging and the shadows imply evil connotations? Therefore, he chuckled and said, I am more inclined to call him the fallen creator. Chapter 94. Hidden Sage, the Fallen Creator. Fallen. Alger ruminated over the fool's words and fell deep in thought. However, what struck Alger the most was the fool's relaxed, natural, and nonchalant attitude. He acted as if they were equal. If he hadn't experienced their previous ritual, Alger might have thought the fool was merely bluffing and building himself up to intimidate him and Justice. But now, he was of the opinion that even if the fool was inferior to the true creator, he was at least close to that level. It's dangerous. It's also an opportunity, Alger muttered softly. He then spoke with a smile, Mr. Fool, your description is indeed more appropriate. According to our observations, Beyonders who believed in the true creator, no, the fallen creator, have a higher probability of losing control. The rest of them are mostly psychopaths. That's something that the Nighthawk's intelligence mentioned as well. And the so-called psychopaths didn't lose their sanity. Instead, their ideologies become twisted. Klein maintained his seated posture but didn't continue with the conversation. He was still considering how to inquire about the secret order and clown potion, but he couldn't figure out a way of asking the questions in a way that fit with his persona. It's such a pity that the gathering is still so different from an internet forum. Otherwise, I could create another Smurf account to join the gathering, and that account would be in charge of asking questions that are inconvenient for me to ask. Perhaps, one day, I'll learn mirror-related magic and give it a try. For example, I can make half the members here my Smurf accounts. There are 22 chairs here, and there are 22 cards in the tarot deck. That matches up perfectly. But when I created this divine hall, I didn't even name myself the Fool or have any intention of forming a tarot club. Do these symbolize the 22 different sequence pathways? I wanted a divine hall, so a divine hall appeared. If I wanted a Smurf account, would I get a Smurf account? Upon seeing the Fool remain silently engulfed in the thick gray fog, Audrey asked both wistfully and curiously, "That sounds scary. Mr. Hangman, could you share, in detail, information about each and every mysterious organization? And also the matters regarding each secret cult? It's hard for me to come into contact with them during my daily life. I can only understand them through the both of you. I'm willing to pay for it. May I know what you'd like in return?" "That's a great question. Miss Justice, you're playing the role of my Smurf account to a certain extent. This way, the Hanged Man will definitely bring up the secret order. You're the best." Klein's mind stirred when he heard that, but he didn't let his emotions show through his expression or movements. Alger thought for a moment before saying, "I need money, £1,000. It'd be best if they weren't bills marked by a serial number. Or maybe gemstones that have just been unearthed. Price them according to the Backlund Jewelry Exchange's monthly average price. £1,000? That's a huge sum of money. It could be used to buy a house in a high-class street in Tingen City. Not everyone would have that available immediately. Captain might have an annual salary like that, I guess." Haley's death compensation was only £300. Although Miss Justice is a noble, she obviously hasn't inherited her family's wealth yet, and she'll only be receiving some sort of annual allowance. It's no wonder that the Hanged Man stated that it could be paid via gemstones. Klein was very sensitive towards monetary figures. Luckily, he was blanketed in thick fog. For a single lady or madam, £2,000 could let her live a decent life. If £2,000 were invested, the investment could reliably produce an annual return of about £100. £8,000? Audrey said, sounding shocked. She then replied happily, "No problem, do I send it to the previous address?" Judging by Miss Justice's tone, she finds it very cheap? Klein didn't look over. Alger was quiet for a good 20 seconds before he said, "Yes, send it to the Warrior and Amp, C-Bar at Pelican Street, in the White Rose borough of Pritz Harbor. Tell the boss, Williams, that it's what the captain wants." "All right." Audrey leaned back and posed in a spectator-like manner. "Mr. Hanged Man, you can start now." Alger looked at the Fool, deliberated for a moment before saying slowly, "Let's start from the Moses Ascetic Order. It is the earliest hidden organization. Of course, many think that the earliest hidden organizations are the Church of the Evernight Goddess, the Church of Mother Earth, and the Church of the God of Combat. These people must be from the Church of Lord of Storms, the Church of Eternal Blazing Sun, or the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom," Audrey refuted sulkily. "The Church of the Goddess is the earliest hidden organization?" That was the first time Klein had heard of such a claim. What exactly happened in the fourth epoch or the third epoch? Alger smiled and said, "The truth is buried in ancient history. Only one thing is certain. No one has ever said that the Church of Lord of Storms, the Church of Eternal Blazing Sun, or the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were once hidden organizations. All right, let's save some time and return to main topic. The Moses Ascetic Order was first established by a few humans that had read the blasphemy slate. They believed in a non-anthropomorphic god, called the Hidden Sage. The description is that of a god, but it is more of an ideology, a natural law. For example, all objects are numeric. The hidden sage is an embodiment of spirit numerology, or that knowledge is supreme and the hidden sage is knowledge itself. Hence, the original Moses Ascetic Order was a very respectable organization, and it maintained a good relationship with the other major churches. The members of the organization led ascetic lives to resist losing control and to resolve the effects of the remnant potion. They strictly kept their order's secrets, and they upheld moral and religious precepts. They believed that humans continuously reincarnate after death. The sequence 9 that they grasp is called mystery prior. The word warlock was also spread from that organization. Audrey listened to the hanged man's description carefully and asked sharply, "You said that the Moses Ascetic Order used to be a respectable organization. Are they not one anymore?" Alger nodded his head indiscernibly. "Yes, they have fallen into corruption and are now an evil organization. But I find their beliefs very good and very normal." Audrey expressed her confusion. That was Klein's confusion too. The information that he could get at his security clearance didn't provide the reason for the Moses Ascetic Order's fall from grace. Alger looked at the unfathomable fool and tersely agreed. "I am not sure of the real reason. It might be because it has been buried by history. However, I have heard one terrifying explanation. In that story, the main reason why the Moses Ascetic Order fell into corruption was because the god that they believed in, the hidden sage, had come to life. He became the personification of an evil god. Came to life? How?" Audrey found it unimaginable as she replied with an incredulous tone. Without realizing it, she had exited from her spectator state. "It's like a horror story, but the ghost is even a god." Klein's heart stirred with a surge of emotions as well. "I'm sorry, no one knows the answer." Alger had originally wanted to casually say, "Maybe Mr. Fool would know," but he held back the urge. He had already teetered on the borders of danger once. In the Book of Storms 5:7, there was a saying that Alger remembered clearly, which was, "Do not test God." Audrey calmed herself down and didn't press for more answers. She gestured for him to continue. Klein maintained his seated posture and his silence, validating the hanged man's descriptions with his own understanding. Finally, he realized that there were 4 points that he needed to take note of. First, the Demonist sect was also known as the Demonist family in the 4th epoch. Back then, they had very few members, and their beliefs were passed down through their bloodlines. Plus, they would kill the fathers of their children and abandon the baby boys. Hence, all the members were female. Of course, that was all from Alger's description, and there was no way to verify it at the moment. Second, the numinous episcopate that believed in death and the Rose school of thought that liked bloody sacrificial worship ceremonies both originated in the southern continent. After the colonial era came, they almost vanished under attacks by the 7 churches. But as such, they began spreading to the northern continent. Third, the current psychology alchemists was similar to the earlier Moses Ascetic Order. They believed in a non-anthropomorphic existence and believed that the human spirit could change everything. Fourth, the secret order had the lowest activity level among all the other hidden organizations. Thus, they were the most unknown. Every time they appeared, they seemed to be after something or looking for something. What are they after or looking for? Klein suddenly recalled the diary which he had read earlier. The leader of the secret order, Zeratul, cooperated with the Roselle. His goal was to get something left behind by the Antigonus family. Their appearance that time was to look for the lost notebook, the Antigonus family notebook. Klein narrowed his eyes slightly and felt that he had apparently found the key reason for the secret order's actions. They are after the things that the Antigonus family left behind. Klein suppressed his urge to tap the edge of the table as his thoughts appeared one after another. Oh, they were looking for remnant traces the Antigonus family left behind? Then must I direct my focus onto these areas to obtain the clown potion formula from the secret order? After a further exchange of information, Klein announced the end of the gathering. By your will. Audrey and Alger stood up together. Cutting off the connections, he saw both their figures shatter and disappear. Klein rubbed his glabella and attempted conjuring a smuff account with his mind. As he thought, a figure appeared at the furthest end of the long bronze table. That figure was wearing a black tuxedo, a silk top hat, and a dull expression. His actions were clumsy and inarticulate. Even though he was engulfed in gray fog, it was obvious that something was wrong with him. That won't do. Klein experimented a few more times before sighing and dismissing the idea of creating a smurf account. He attempted other things too. He continued to sit above the gray fog in the seat of honor at the long bronze table. He considered what Audrey had said, and he cast his gaze curiously at the illusory crimson stars. After a moment of silence, Klein started to pray as a form of feedback instead of establishing contact with those stars. Amidst the tranquility and silence, he didn't receive any feedback from the 10+ crimson stars nearby. In order to receive feedback, I need to pull someone above the gray fog before I can reply? Klein nodded as he thought, feeling somewhat disappointed. He didn't want to violate someone else's will and forcefully pull them into this mysterious space. Klein was just getting ready to leave, but he habitually touched a nearby illusory crimson star. Just then, he suddenly felt that there was a faint and insignificant prayer deep inside the crimson star. Chapter 95. The Supplicant, a Prayer? Klein's mind stirred as he used the same method he used back when he spied on the hanged man. He allowed his spirituality to spread outward and touch the crimson blob. A hazy and contorted image appeared within his sight. He could faintly see a blonde teen kneeling on the ground, facing a pure crystal ball. That teenager was dressed in a tight-fitting black outfit, with a style very different from the contemporary styles of the Lone Kingdom. It was more congruent with the traditional clothing of the Faesac Empire and the Intis Republic that Klein had seen from reading magazines. The area surrounding the teenager was dark and had old furniture. From time to time, the room would be illuminated, but Klein couldn't hear the roaring thunder or the pattering of rain. In the image, the teenager had his hands on his forehead, fingers crossed. He bowed forward, continually praying for something. His thick accent buzzed in Klein's ears. Klein listened attentively but discovered an awkward fact. He couldn't understand what the other party was saying. It was a language that he had never come across in his life. To think that I cannot understand a foreign language even though I am the mysterious ruler of this world above the gray fog. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He indignantly tried listening in once again in a manner more attentive than when he had to do English listening comprehension tests back on Earth. As he was listening to the prayers, he gradually discovered something. Even though he had never learned the language the young man was speaking, he found that it had similarities to ancient Faesac. Father, Mother. Those are likely the meanings of those two terms, right? It is quite similar to ancient Faesac, but not without its differences. Klein creased his brows and slipped into deep thought. Ancient Faesac was a common language in the Fourth Epic. It is also the root language of all the contemporary languages of this era. Furthermore, it is still evolving. I cannot confirm it right now. He listened to it over and over again, eliminating the possibility of the language being a modern language like Lone, Faesac, or Intis. Could it be a dialect of ancient Faesac? Like the language used in the Antigonus family's diary? Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the bronze table and nodded indiscernibly. There was another possibility. Ancient Faesac didn't spring into existence out of nothing. It was an evolution of Jotun, the language of the giants. The Faesac Empire in the north has always claimed that its people possesses the bloodline of the giants. Perhaps this is ancient Jotun. At this point, Klein, who lacked knowledge, could only stop. He retracted his spirituality without looking or listening into that scene. He had no intention of pulling the praying teen up above the fog immediately. He wanted to know what the young man was talking about first. Of course, before that, he had to observe him frequently and conduct basic tests. Phew! Klein exhaled as he leaned back in his chair. He enveloped himself with his spirituality and simulated the feeling of falling. After revising Roselle's diary, Klein changed into his formal wear and left for the divination club. He took the public transport despite his pay rise, but he did splurge to support Mrs. Wendy's business. He spent 1.5 pence on sweet iced tea to combat the afternoon heat. When he arrived at House Street, Klein tossed the empty cup into the trash can and walked up to the second floor. Before entering the building, he pinched his glabella and activated his spirit vision. Klein had just entered the hall when he felt a faint, lingering grief. The pretty receptionist Angelica was sitting there. Her slightly red eyes looked unfocused. "The grief will pass in time," Klein said with a gentle and firm tone as he walked toward Angelica. Angelica looked up abruptly and muttered, clearly confused, "Mr. Moretti?" She quickly came to her senses and asked, perturbed, "Why, you already know about Mr. Vincent?" "Oh right, I forgot that you're an exceptional fortune-teller." Klein sighed appropriately. "I only managed to divine a very rough outline of what transpired. Just what exactly happened to Mr. Vincent?" "The boss told us that Mr. Vincent had a heart attack in his sleep and left this world peacefully." Angelica cried as she said, "He was so friendly, so polite, a true gentleman. He was the spiritual mentor of so many of our members. He was still so young. I am sorry for bringing up this sad topic." Klein didn't console her any further. He walked toward the meeting room slowly. Angelica took out a handkerchief and wiped her eyes and nose. She then looked at Klein's back and asked loudly, "Mr. Moretti, what would you like to drink?" "Black tea." Klein preferred black tea to coffee, even though he found the black tea average. In comparison, he preferred ginger beer and sweet iced tea. But as a gentleman, it was not right for him to act like a child in a formal setting. As it was a Monday, there were only 5 or 6 members in the meeting room. Using his spirit vision, Klein saw that they each had different colors of emotion. Some were grieving, some more dull, some relatively unaffected. They're all rather normal reactions. Klein nodded slightly. He picked up his cane and found a spot in the room. He was about to deactivate his spirit vision when he saw Angelica walk in and walk towards him. "Mr. Moretti, a customer is looking for you." "Well, it's the person from last time," the beautiful lady said with a hushed tone. "You still remember him?" Klein asked with a smile. I wonder if he bought the magical medicine as I instructed. I wonder if he still needs surgery." Angelica covered her mouth and said, "He was the only person who was willing to wait an entire afternoon in the club for a divination." Klein grabbed his cane and stood up. He walked outside without saying anything. In the reception area, he found the person who had sought his services the other day. He also noticed that the aura near his liver had regained its normal color. His overall health had also improved. "Congratulations, the feeling of being healthy is wonderful indeed." Klein smiled as he extended a hand. Bogda was first taken aback before he immediately extended both hands. He grabbed Klein's right palm tightly. "Mr. Moretti, you truly can see my condition." "Yes, I have fully recovered. The doctors asked me questions over and over again, ran repeated tests on me, but they cannot believe that I recovered just like that." Upon hearing Bogda's ecstatic description, Klein calmly confirmed one thing. The apothecary at Lawson's folk herb store was definitely a beyonder. He had seen how severe the man's liver disease had been. Fully healing him in the span of a few days was beyond the capability of herbs and medical ability. The only possible explanation was that of a beyonder. Coupled with the incident with Glassy, there could only be one answer. "I have to repent to God. To think that I would suspect that miraculous doctor." Bogda refused to let go of Klein's hand. He continued on about his shame and gratitude. "Those 10 pounds were truly money well spent. It bought my life back." "What? 10 pounds? You spent 10 pounds on the miraculous medicine? And you only gave me 8 pence for my divination? Just 8 pence, This." Klein was dazed just hearing about it. At this moment, Bogda released his hands as he took a step back while beaming. He bowed reverently and said, "I am here today to express my gratitude. Thank you, Master Moretti. You showed me the way and saved my life. This was the outcome of you paying to have something divined. You need not thank anybody." Klein lifted his head slightly and looked at the divide between the wall and the ceiling. His answer fully expressed the vibes of a charlatan. "You are a true seer," Bogda praised. "Next, I'll be heading to Vlad Street to thank that apothecary and buy the medicine he recommended." "Haven't you already recovered?" Klein expertly hid the shock in his voice. Bogda looked around and laughed when he confirmed that the receptionist was not paying attention to them. He chuckled softly and said, "The doctor mentioned a concoction of herbs that includes mummy powder. It is a prescription that would satisfy both men and women." I didn't believe the doctor back then, but I have no more doubts now. There's a prescription like that? Klein suddenly felt that the apothecary was a cheat, and suspected if he had pushed the person in front of him into a fiery pit of doom. He observed Bogda and confirmed that there was no problem with his aura. "Mummy powder?" Klein cautiously asked. "Yes, mummy powder. I have asked a friend. He said that even the nobles of Backlund are maniacally looking for such an item. It's a powder made by grinding mummies which gives men peak performance in bed. Even though it's disgusting and sounds dirty, it truly is a material used by the aristocrats." Bogda gave a detailed description. He had an eager desire in his eyes. Mummies? Mummies made from corpses? Then grinding them to powder? Klein was dumbfounded. He nearly retched in front of Bogda. Those nobles sure are hardcore. Just as he was about to advise Bogda against doing so, Glassy, who had suffered from a lung disease previously, stepped into the door and heard Bogda's description. "Yes, it's very effective. I would recommend that you head to Lawson's Folk Herbs store at Vlad Street. Mr. Lawson's secret recipe is very effective." Glassy took off his spectacles and leaned over with interest. He recommended with a hushed tone, "My experience was very, very, very perfect. You know of it too? I was just about to head to Mr. Lawson's Folk Herb store." Bogda's worries vanished completely. After a short conversation, he left the divination club in a hurry. Up until then, Klein was still a little dumbfounded. He waited till 5:20 in the afternoon before putting on his hat and picking up his black cane. He took a carriage down to Vlad Street, intending to observe the apothecary named Lawson Darkweed before deciding if he should notify the captain or not. 18 Vlad Street. Klein stood outside the herb store and saw the closed door, as well as a subletting notice. Quite a wary man, he muttered silently. Since this had happened, he no longer had to be troubled or perform any observations. Chapter 96. Daly's guess. By the afternoon of the next day, Klein had fully recovered from any signs of exhaustion. He walked into the Blackthorn Security Company with steady footsteps. "Good morning, Klein. The weather is so cool and beautiful today. I'm looking forward to tonight's feast." Rose Ann, who was wearing a light green dress, greeted him with a smile from behind the reception desk. Klein deliberately touched his stomach and said, "Miss Rose, you shouldn't be talking about that so early in the morning. I'm already sick of today's mission that has yet to arrive. I only hope for the evening to arrive sooner." "Me too." Rose Ann chuckled. She looked to the left and right, then she beckoned for Klein to come closer. She lowered her voice and said, "I met Madame Daly earlier." "Spirit medium Madame Daly?" Klein asked in surprise. The most famous spirit medium from Alwa County had been living at Enmat Harbor all this time, and it wasn't a short distance from Tingen. "Yes." Rose Ann gave a firm nod and said, "But she has already left. She is my ideal beyonder. If I were to become a spirit medium, I would leave Tingen and travel all around the world by myself. To Intis, to Faysek, to Fainapotter, to the southern continent, to the vast prairies, primitive forests, and snow-covered plains. Lady, be aware of the Nighthawk's rules." Klein shook his head in amusement. "Even Madame Daly has to apply and obtain permission to leave Enmat Harbor. I know that, but you can't just remind me about it now and shatter my dreams." Rosen said peeved. "The truth is I would never become a beyonder. It's too dangerous. I know when I'll die from sudden gunfire. From what I've seen, beyonders are basically people who turn themselves into monsters to fight against monsters. Archbishop Cheney said that we are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness," Klein replied, sighing. The quote had left a deep impression on him. To fight against the abyss, we have to endure the corruption of the abyss. The two of them fell silent in unison. Rosen was the first to break the silence as she pursed her lips towards the partition and said, "Captain wanted you to meet him when you arrived." "All right." With his hat and cane in hand, Klein passed through the partition and entered Dunn's office after knocking on the door. A middle-aged gentleman with deep and serene gray eyes and a high hairline put down his coffee cup and said with a smile, "Daly was here." "Can't say that I'm surprised. Rosen had just informed me," Klein replied with a smile. Dunn didn't mind his humor but sighed. Daly was just transferred to the Backlund Diocese, which is the world's busiest and most crowded city. They have the highest population of Beyonders and the most opportunities. She has a higher chance of becoming an archbishop or a senior deacon than me. Why? Klein asked curiously as he took a seat. Dunn thought for nearly 20 seconds before answering. She has a unique talent in mastering and exploiting sequence potions. I've mentioned the internal rule of the Nighthawks before. If you want to consume the next potion in the sequence, you'll have to wait 3 years and go through a strict examination to prevent any loss of control. But typically, 3 years is far from sufficient. I spent 3 years going from a sleepless to a midnight poet. It took me 9 years to go from a midnight poet to nightmare, a full 9 years. And to go from nightmare to sequence 6, I've already spent 3 years. I have no idea how many more years I need. When our bodies age and our energy starts to decline, even if we overcome the latent dangers, we shouldn't attempt advancing anymore. This is because the risk of losing control at that point is so high that no one is willing to risk it. As for Daly and I, we are different from most Beyonders. After she became a corpse collector, she handed in a special application after only a year. She hoped to consume the follow-up potion immediately. What surprised everyone was that she actually passed through the stricter examination and obtained the Gravedigger potion. It only took her 1 more year to go from Gravedigger to Spirit Medium. This year will be her 5th year as a Beyonder. She is only 24 this year, young enough to have many opportunities ahead of her. On the surface, she's the most famous spirit medium in Alwa County, but she truly is an actual spirit medium. Isn't that acting? Old Neil had apparently mentioned that Madame Daly had similar tendencies. Klein felt that he had grasped the key reason for Madame Daly's quick ascension through the ranks. "Captain, you're young enough as well." "You're only in your 30s, Klein comforted Dunn, but added in his heart, "It's just that your memory isn't that great." Dunn drank a sip of his coffee. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. "Why didn't you ask Madame Daly about her method of mastering and exploiting sequence potions?" Klein purposely asked. Dunn put down his coffee cup and massaged his temples as he spoke. "She told me to become a true nightmare. I don't know what that means." "Play the role of a nightmare." "Man, a nightmare sounds sinister." Klein creased his eyebrows and temporarily fell silent. Then, Dunn took out his smoking pipe and sniffed at it. "Daly and I discussed the possibility of Seer's follow-up potion being Clown. Assuming that the member of the Seers didn't lie to you, she brought up an interesting hypothesis." "What hypothesis?" Klein asked hurriedly, his eyes turning bright. He had once used a divination method to determine if Clown was the follow-up potion of Seer. The answer he received had been vague, but it seemed close to being a confirmation. Dunn's deep and serene gray eyes swept his gaze at him while he said in thought, "A normal sequence pathway proceeds in a stepped manner. They advance according to a particular similarity. For instance, Sleepless, Midnight Poet, and Nightmare are all obviously related to the darkness of the night, as well as the peaceful sleep and tranquility that is generated from sleep. It can be imagined that every subsequent sequence would have identical traits, only with more power and a wider scope. They might be linked to secrets, disaster, horror, the crimson moon, etc. Certain sequence pathways appear unrelated, but when we analyze them in detail, we can still find similarities, such as assassin and instigator. Their implied similarity is to bring people calamities, pain, sorrow, and despair. Hence, the follow-up sequences should abide by this pattern." Klein paid close attention and asked proactively, "But Seer and Clown doesn't have such a connection?" "Yeah." Dunn nodded and said, "Daly believes that there might be sequence pathways that share another kind of relationship. After all, there's a lot we do not know." He paused for a moment before saying, "Daly said that, in this sort of pathway, the low to mid-sequence potions would respectively provide the Beyonder an ability that seems brand new and unrelated to the others. When the Beyonder reaches a point of qualitative change, These abilities will mix into an abnormally powerful job that includes them all. In other words, the pathway doesn't advance step by step, but instead it's a relationship of dissection and combination. Klein listened intently, but he felt lost. Dunn lifted his right hand and said, "A normal sequence pathway advances a bit at a time, just like a child growing up. A growing child becomes taller, stronger, heavier, and more mature from a young age. While special sequence pathways are more like." Having said this, Dunn lifted up his thumb. "This is sequence 9. Then he lifted up his index finger. "This is sequence 8. Then he gradually lifted up the rest of his fingers. Each and every finger is independent and doesn't seem to be related to the others. But in the end, when he said the word end, Dunn clenched his fingers into a tight fist. "I understand now." Klein was suddenly enlightened. He agreed with Lady Daly's guess and the captain's metaphor. Maybe that's how it is? He nodded in deep thought. Sequence 8 Clown and Sequence 9 Seer are completely different and have brand new abilities. And according to the description from the Nighthawk's intelligence, the corresponding Sequence 7 and Sequence 8 Clown don't share any similarities either. Klein fell silent for a while before curiously pressing on. At which stage would the different abilities combine to form a qualitative change? Dunn took another sip of coffee and chuckled. "Daly and I guessed Sequence 4. "Why?" Klein blurted out. "Because according to the way the churches categorize sequences, Sequence 4 is the beginning point of the higher sequences. It is said that merely achieving such a level brings about qualitative changes in vitality and energy. In ancient times, Sequence 4 Beyonders were qualified to be called demigods in the fourth epoch. It's a pity that such Beyonders are very rare in this era," Dunn said wistfully. "If Sequence 4 to Sequence 1 are high sequence Beyonders, then who are the low sequence Beyonders?" Klein asked with interest. Sequences 9 through 7 were considered as low sequences 1,000 years ago. But in recent centuries, Beyonders are few in number and each church has listed Sequence 7 as a mid-sequence. Dunn laughed in a self-deprecating manner. Sequence 9 and Sequence 8 are low sequences. Then, Sequences 7 through 5 are mid-sequences. Finally, those Sequence 4 and above are high sequences. Klein repeated in his head and inevitably felt a yearning for that. Emperor Roselle was a high sequence Beyonder. However, the higher the sequence, the greater the risk of losing control. Klein thought to himself in fear. He asked as though in a seemingly casual manner, "What is the Sequence 4 potion for the Church of the Goddess called?" "In actual fact, I'm not sure. My security clearance isn't high enough for me to be privy to that information. I'll be able to read them when I become a diocese bishop or Nighthawk's deacon." Dunn shook his head and smiled. In fact, at least half of the church's 13 archbishops and 9 senior deacons at the top of the church's hierarchy are below Sequence 4. That's just me being optimistic. The archbishop in Zangwill, who became wanted, lost control when he tried to advance to Sequence 4. The one who stole sealed artifact 0-08? His potion was apparently called Gatekeeper? Klein thought and probed, is Sleepless Sequence 5 Gatekeeper? No, that's in Spirit Medium's pathway. You'll be allowed to access that information when you reach Sequence 7 and become a bishop or a captain of a Nighthawks team. Gatekeeper is Sequence 5 of the Spirit Medium pathway? Does it mean that it's keeping watch over the gates to hell? Or keeping watch over the gates to the spirit world? Klein guessed. All right, go to Old Neil and continue with your studies. Dunn smiled and said, "Don't forget about dinner tonight at Old Will's restaurant. Reservations have been made. I'll introduce you to the rest of the Nighthawks officially." "All right, I've already prepared the money." Klein forced a smile. "No, there's no need. Have you forgotten that we have additional bonuses? The part about you completing an assigned mission." Dunn waved. Klein was momentarily taken aback before replying with a beaming smile, "All right, Captain." He turned around and walked towards the door, while counting inwardly, 3, 2, 1. Why didn't Captain call me back?" Klein dragged out one for a very long time, only to be surprised that Captain Dunn Smith hadn't forgotten to add anything. A miracle? In the armory, Old Neil stole a glance at Klein, who was in a good mood. Don't be obsessed with tonight's dinner. You still have a lot of things to learn, such as more ritualistic magic, ancient Hermes, Dragonish, Elvish, and many more. Yeah, every afternoon besides your day off, you have to have at least 2 hours of combat training with an instructor. Combat training? Captain didn't mention it. Klein was shocked. Old Neil nodded and didn't hesitate to answer. He forgot. Chapter 97. Combat teacher at 2 in the afternoon, outside of a simple 2-storied building that was in disrepair at the outskirts of the North Borough. Klein, who was in his probationary inspector uniform, looked at the weed-filled garden and the vines that had crept up the walls. He turned his head in surprise. My combat instructor lives here? Shouldn't a combat artist who was selected by the Nighthawks be exceptional? Leonard Mitchell, who had guided Klein there, snickered and said, "Don't underestimate Mr. Gawain because of his residence's surroundings. Although he was never conferred an aristocratic title, he was a true knight back in the day." Having said that, the poetic Nighthawk, who was dressed in a white shirt, black trousers, and buttonless leather boots, suddenly felt melancholic. He was active during the waning era of the knights. The warriors donning their armors would storm through enemy ranks despite the gunfire and cannon fire, destroying their enemies and redefining the battle lines. But alas, they were quickly met with the invention of the high-pressure steam guns and 6-barrel machine guns. From then on, the knights had to gradually step down. Mr. Gawain met the same fate. More than 20 years ago, the Alwa Knights Order of Chivalry faced the most advanced weaponry of the Intis Republic Army. Sigh, every time I recall this, it seems like I'm touching the dust heaps of history. The poet in me stirs when thinking of this irreversible and fated destiny, but alas, I do not know how to compose the poem. Then what's the point in saying so much? Klein acted oblivious to Leonard's self-deprecation and gave a serious suggestion. My university schoolmate once told me that the composing of poems requires a certain degree of talent. It's best you start by reading the classical poems anthology of the Lone Kingdom. Leonard's mood changed on a whim. He replied with a light-hearted tone, "I purchased that book a long time ago, as well as other titles, such as the selected poems of Emperor Roselle. I will work hard to become a true midnight poet." Mr. Sear, is he hinting at the acting method? Klein replied, as though he couldn't understand him, "You would still need books on grammar." "All right, let's enter." Leonard extended his hand and pushed open the half-closed metallic gates. The two of them then followed the path towards the house. They were still a distance away from the house when Klein saw a tall man walking out from behind the main door. He had short blonde hair, his brows already laced with white hairs. His facial features looked like they had been ravaged through age, his wrinkles were etched deep across his face. "What are you doing here?" the aged man asked in a deep voice. "Mr. Gawain, as per your contract with the police department, this probationary inspector will be learning the art of combat under your guidance," Leonard explained with a smile. "Combat? There's no need to study combat in this era." Gawain looked at Klein with turbid eyes and said in a dead voice, "You should learn how to draw your gun and shoot. You should master the most advanced weaponry." Was this the psychological trauma caused by the 6-barrel machine guns and high-pressure steam guns? Klein didn't give a reckless reply. Instead, he smiled and looked at Leonard. The art of combat is still a skill a policeman has to master. Most of the criminals we face are not those who must be executed on the spot. Some might not even have weapons. In that case, we have to rely on combat techniques, Leonard said, obviously prepared for the situation. With a dark expression, Gawain fell silent for more than 10 seconds before saying, "Throw a punch." He was speaking to Klein. Klein, who was not holding his cane, remembered the boxing matches he had seen in his previous life. He raised his arm and threw it forward. Gawain's lips twitched indiscernibly. He thought for a moment and said, "Kick." Tilting to the side slightly and twisting his hips, Klein tightened his thigh muscles and kicked forward with his right foot. Gawain covered his mouth and cleared his throat. He looked at Leonard and said, "I will honor my contract. But based on his foundation, he needs to come here 4 times a week, 3 hours each time, for the first month. You're the combat expert. It's up to you." Leonard nodded without hesitation. He smiled and said to Klein, "See you at dinner." After Leonard walked out the metallic gates, Klein asked out of curiosity, "Instructor, how should I begin practicing? Punching or footwork?" As a qualified keyboard warrior, he understood the importance of footwork in combat. Gawain stood akimbo as he shook his head lethargically. "What you need now is strength training. See those? Those are 2 dumbbells made of steel. They shall be your partners for today. Other than that, you also have to practice deep squats, running, and rope skipping. Let us take those 1 set at a time." While Klein was still in a daze, Gawain suddenly raised his voice and said sternly, "Understood. Understood." At this moment, Klein felt as though he had returned to military training and was facing an inhumane instructor. "Change out of your clothes. There's a set of knight's training clothes on the sofa." Gawain suddenly sighed. He turned around and walked toward the black steel dumbbells. 6 in the evening, at a corner table of the Old Will restaurant. Other than Fry, who was guarding Cheney's gate, all the members of the Blackthorn Security Company were present. There were 6 Nighthawks and 5 civilian staff. A white tablecloth was draped over the long table. Waiters carried over plates of food, portioned them before serving them to each individual guest. Klein saw steaks drenched in black pepper sauce. He saw bacon, sausages paired with mashed potatoes, egg puddings, asparagus, and specialty cheeses. He even saw rose-colored champagne. However, he had no appetite. The training in the afternoon had nearly made him vomit. Noticing the pale, newly inducted Nighthawk with turbid eyes, Dunn raised the glass of red wine in front of him and laughed. "Let us welcome our newest official member, Klein Moretti, cheers." The cold and introverted black-haired lady, Royale Radin, the sleepless Kenley White, the sloppy Leonard Mitchell, as well as the white-haired, black-eyed midnight poet Sika Tron all raised their cups and looked at the new member of their team. Klein fought back the discomfort of the training and raised his glass of amber champagne. He stood and said, "Thank you." He clinked glasses with every Nighthawk, tilted his head back, and finished the small amount of champagne. "Is our Miss Author not going to say something on this occasion?" Dunn smiled as he looked at Sikatron. Sikatron was a lady in her 30s. She had average looks, but had an exceptional demeanor, one that was quiet and serene. Coupled with her few strands of graying hair, it added a unique charm to her. Klein had heard old Neil mention that this midnight poet had taken on a side job as an author and had attempted to submit her works to newspapers and magazines. Unfortunately, only a few smaller newspapers had accepted them. Sika smiled and looked at Dunn. "In order to make the term Miss Author into a reality, Captain, I think you should give me some funds to self-publish my work." Dunn laughed. "You should learn from old Neil and give me a more suitable reason. I'm most impressed with Mr. Neil in this department." Rose and echoed in between her mouthfuls of roast mutton. Amidst the chatter and laughter, Leonard looked at Klein and said with a chuckle, "Are you so tired that you have no appetite to eat?" "Yeah." Klein sighed. "If you haven't touched your food yet, I can be of assistance." Leonard acted as though he didn't want to waste any food. Klein didn't mind. He nodded and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." And with that, a good portion of the food in front of him was eaten by Leonard and the rest. Nearing the end of the dinner, the waiters served plates of beef pudding and ice cream. Klein tasted ice cream and found it cold and sweet. It was particularly appetizing. Before he realized it, he had finished the ice cream drizzled with a blueberry sauce. And as a result of this, he started to feel the hunger pangs. It was a hunger which demanded recharging food that came after intense exertion. Swallowing his saliva, Klein looked to the front, only to see that all the plates were empty. There were no leftovers. "Let's end the dinner here, and give Klein a final toast," Dunn suggested. Before finishing his sentence, Klein asked, "Captain, may I order another plate of food?" The group fell silent after hearing such a request, only to break out into chuckles moments later. "Ah, you finally recovered. No problem, order 2 plates if you want to." Dunn shook his head and laughed. While patiently waiting an unbearable amount of time, Klein heard his stomach growling. Finally, a freshly prepared black pepper steak was served before him. His fork and knife danced as Klein finished the medium-done steak in 90 seconds, tears nearly falling from his eyes. The meat juices and the fragrance of the sauce lingered in his mouth. Sometime later, Klein let out a satisfied sigh as he looked at his empty plate. He put down his knife and fork and took a sip of his champagne. "Waiter, the bill please." Dunn turned around and called for the waiter. The waiter went to the counter, then returned with the check. He gave a thorough breakdown. "You opened 5 bottles of Desi champagne, each bottle being 12 soldi and 3 pence, a small glass of Southville red wine for 10 pence. Each black pepper beefsteak was 1 soldi 2 pence. Each serving of beef pudding was 6 pence. The servings of ice cream was 1 soldi each. The total would be £5, 9 soldi, and 6 pence. £5, 9 soldi, and 6 pence? That's nearly my weekly salary. A restaurant is indeed much more expensive than eating at home." Klein clicked his tongue upon hearing that. He felt lucky that the captain had said that he didn't need to pay out of his own pocket. They had some petty cash from bonus earnings. He calculated the cost carefully and noticed that the most expensive portion of the meal was the alcohol. 5 bottles of champagne had cost more than £3. This is no different from Earth. Klein secretly rubbed his stomach and forced down the last of his champagne. The next morning, Klein felt bloated. He tried to get off the bed in his sleepy stupor. Just as he exerted strength, he was instantly awakened by his aching muscles. He felt as though his body wasn't under his control. What a familiar feeling. It's the same as that day after we got punished with frog jumps. Today is a rest day, but I still have to pay a visit to my mentor and see if I can borrow the monograph on the Hornacis main peak from the library at the university. Klein's lips twitched as he made his way outside with some effort. He wanted to draw a gasp with every step. "Klein, what happened to you?" Melissa, who had just come out of the bathroom, sized up her brother suspiciously for his odd posture and slow movement. Chapter 98. Mr. Azik, faced with his sister's question, all Klein could do was reply with a regretful smile, "Sore muscles." He originally believed that by consuming the sequence potion his constitution would be enhanced as a Beyonder, but the harsh reality told him that a seer's stats points were all allocated to his spirituality, mind, intuition, and interpretation. It didn't aid him in adjusting to combat training quickly. As for the original Klein, he had focused on his studies early on and had suffered from malnutrition. That led him to possess a below-average physical condition. The fact that he was having after effects from working out was to be expected. "Sore muscles? I remember you returning after dinner last night and you didn't do anything else. Does alcohol cause sore muscles?" Melissa inquired with an inquisitive look. "Does alcohol cause sore muscles? Sis, that question can't help but make me have inappropriate thoughts." Klein laughed dryly and said, "No, this has nothing to do with alcohol. It was from yesterday afternoon. I joined the company's combat training." "Combat?" Melissa was even more astonished. Klein organized his thoughts and said, "Well, this is what happened. I considered it and believe that as a historical and relic consultant of a security company, it's impossible for me to stay in the office or port warehouse forever. Perhaps there will come a day when I have to accompany them to the villages or an ancient castle to the site of some relic. That might require me to hike, to cross rivers, and to walk a lot. I'll have to endure all sorts of tests posed by nature, so I have to possess a sufficiently healthy body." "So you joined combat training to enhance your stamina?" Melissa seemed to understand her brother's intention. "That's right," Klein answered with great affirmation. Melissa said with a frown, "But that isn't gentlemanly. Don't you always keep yourself to the standards of a professor? A professor only requires the ability to read historical documents, ponder over difficult questions, and maintain a polite and gentlemanly demeanor. Of course, I'm not saying that those aren't all good things. I prefer men who can solve problems on their own, regardless of whether that solution requires brawn or brain." Melissa smiled. Klein smiled and said, No, Melissa. Your definition of a professor contains a misconception. A true professor can communicate with people gently and politely, But he can also educate the other person using the principles of physics by raising a cane to convince someone when there is an obstacle in communication. Principles of physics. Melissa was momentarily at a loss, but she quickly understood what her brother was saying. She was suddenly unable to retort him. Klein didn't say anything more but widened his pace with great difficulty as he headed for the bathroom. Melissa stood there and looked for a few seconds. She suddenly shook her head and caught up to Klein. "Do you need my help?" She posed as if she was supporting someone. "No, there's no need to. I was hamming it up a bit earlier." Klein felt humiliated. He suddenly stood straight and walked normally. Watching her brother walk steadily to the washroom and close the door, Melissa pursed her lips and muttered, "Klein is getting more and more pretentious." I even believed that his muscle soreness was really that serious. In the bathroom, Klein stood behind the tightly shut door, his face suddenly contorting in pain. He held his breath, tensed his body, and stood there for a good 7 or 8 seconds. When he finally went downstairs with great effort, had breakfast, and saw Benson and Melissa off, his soreness finally began to ease. After resting for a little while, Klein took his cane, donned his top hat, and left the house, strolling towards the public carriage stop. During the summer, Koei University had trees with shade-providing foliage, flourishing with birds and luxuriant flowers. It was peaceful and calm. Walking along the river, Klein took a turn towards the history department. Then he found the 3-story building which showed its age and located his mentor's, Cohen Quinton's, office. He knocked and entered the room, but he was shocked to see that the man sitting at his mentor's seat was the academic, Azik. "Good morning, Mr. Azik. Where's my mentor?" "We made an appointment by letter to meet here at 10, Klein asked, puzzled. Azik, who was Cohen Quinton's best friend and often debated with his mentor regarding academic topics, smiled and said, "Cohen had a last-minute meeting and went to Tianjin University. He asked me to wait for you here." He had bronze skin, an average height and build, black hair, brown eyes, and gentle facial features. Being in his presence brought on an indescribable feeling, as though you could see in the man's eyes that he had been through the vicissitudes of life. Under his right ear was a tiny mole that one wouldn't notice unless closely examined. Having said the reason, Azik suddenly frowned as he carefully observed Klein. Feeling confused by the sudden scrutiny, Klein looked at his attire. "Have I committed some breach of etiquette?" Tuxedo, black vest, white shirt, black bow tie, dark-colored trousers, leather boots with no buttons. Everything seems normal. Azik's brows eased and he chuckled softly. "Don't mind me. I suddenly noticed that you are way more energetic than before. You look even more like a gentleman now." "Thank you for your compliment." Klein accepted it calmly and asked, "Mr. Azik, did my mentor manage to find the book Research of the Hornacis Main Peaks Relics in the school library?" "He found it with my assistance," Azik said, smiling gently. He then pulled open the drawer and took out a gray-covered book. "You are no longer a Koei University student anymore. You can read it here, but you cannot take it home." "All right." Klein delightfully took the academic monograph, and with a hint of fear. The book's design was fully in line with the current trends. It used hard paper as a hardcover and it was printed with an image like an abstract version of the main peak of Hornacis mountain range. Klein took a glance and found a seat. He flipped open the book and started reading carefully, line by line. As he became engrossed in the book, he suddenly realized that there was a cup of rich and fragrant coffee by his side. "Help yourself to the sugar and milk." Azik put down the silver saucer and pointed at the milk jar and sugar container. "Thank you." Klein nodded with gratitude. He added 3 cubes of sugar and a teaspoon of milk before continuing to read his book. The book, Research of the Hornacis Main Peaks Relics, was not a very thick book. Klein finished reading it when it was almost noon. He took note of a few noteworthy points. First, the settlement on the main peak of Hornacis Mountain and its surrounding area was obviously an advanced civilization, which existed as part of an ancient nation. Second, from their wall murals, their perspective on life appears similar to that of humans. I can assume for now that they were human. Third, they revered yet feared the darkness of the night. Hence, they called their god the ruler of the Evernight, mother of the sky. Fourth, The weirdest part is that researchers haven't found any graves in the entire area, which initially seems to indicate that the people didn't need to be buried, because they didn't die. However, that would be contradictory to the contents of the wall murals. In the wall murals, the people in the nation believed that death is not the end. They believed that their deceased family would protect them in the night. Hence, they would keep their deceased family members at home, on the bed, by their side, for a full 3 days. There is nothing beyond that for the wall murals, as it doesn't involve burials. Klein took another sip of coffee and continued to write down his afterthoughts in his notebook. Mother of the Sky. Sky Mother is such a grand title, while the ruler of the Evernight obviously overlaps with the Evernight goddess. Is this a contradiction at its roots? In the ancient remains on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range and its surrounding area, every arrangement and decoration was well preserved. Even the wall murals didn't have any signs of damage. Before it was discovered, there seemed to be no disturbance at all. The table was arranged with cutlery, and there were dried stains of rot on the dining plates. In some rooms, there were half-filled bottles of alcohol that had almost turned into plain water. What happened to the nation's people? They seemed to have left their homes in a hurry, without taking anything with them, and they never returned. Considering how there are no burial grounds, this only makes it weirder. The author, Mr. Joseph, also mentioned that when he first discovered the remains, he even had the belief that the people residing there had just vanished all of a sudden. Klein stopped writing and cast his gaze at an illustration. On John Joseph's third visit to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range, he had used a new camera model to shoot a monochrome photograph. In the photo, the lofty palace had a collapsed wall and was overgrown with weeds. It followed a grandeur style for its design. When he flipped to the photograph, Klein's first thought was that of the palace he had seen in his dream. The two styles were identical. The only difference was that the one he had dreamed of was on a peak and it was way more magnificent. It also had a huge chair, a seat of honor, that looked like it didn't seat a human. Countless translucent maggots clustered together and squirmed slowly beneath the chair. I can confirm that my dream is related to the ancient remains on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. That should be the nation of the Evernight, which was referenced in the Antigonus family's notebook. Klein nodded slightly and closed the book. At that moment, Isaac, who was sitting opposite him, touched the inconspicuous mole under his right ear and said, "How was it? Found anything?" "Quite a bit. Take a look, I've written so many pages of notes." Klein pointed at the table and smiled. "I don't understand why you're suddenly so interested in this matter." Isaac sighed and said, "Klein, when I was studying at the Backland University, I had dabbled with some divination and did quite a bit of research on that. Well, I discovered that there is disharmony in your fate." "What? Divination? Are you talking to me about divination?" As a seer, Klein looked at Isaac the academic in amusement. "How is it disharmonious?" Isaac thought for a moment. "Have you encountered many strange coincidences in the past 2 months?" Coincidences? As he was indebted to Mr. Isaac, Klein didn't dispute his question as he subconsciously began thinking. If we are talking about coincidences, the most obvious matter was when we were after kidnappers. We actually managed to find clues of the Antigonus family's notebook that was lost for days in the room opposite the kidnappers. Also, Ray Bieber didn't flee from Tingen in a hurry. Instead, he found a place to digest the power bestowed by the notebook, allowing for sealed artifact 2-049 to track him down easily. That seemed to be against common sense. Although Iyer Harson gave a reasonable explanation, I always had a nagging feeling that it was somewhat coincidental. Oh, Selena had stolen a glance at Hannes Vincent's secret incantations, but she held back till her birthday dinner banquet to try it out, and I happened to discover it, which is quite a coincidence too. Otherwise, Hannes Vincent wouldn't have been the only one to die so suddenly. Klein thought about it seriously for a few minutes and said, "There are 3. Neither too many, nor too frequent. Furthermore, there was nothing that indicated someone's involvement and guidance." Isaac nodded slightly. As Emperor Roselle once said, "A single coincidence is encountered by anyone. Twice is still normal. Thrice is when one should consider what internal factors are influencing those coincidences." Can you tell me anything else? Klein probed. Azik laughed and shook his head. I can only tell that there's some disharmony, but nothing else. You have to understand that I'm not a real seer. Isn't that basically equal to saying nothing? Mr. Azik is quite odd. He's playing a charlatan in front of a charlatan like me. Klein let out a breath. Seizing the moment when Azik stood up, he pinched his glabella and activated his spirit vision. When he looked over, Azik's aura fully appeared before his eyes and everything seemed fairly normal. Unfortunately, I can only see the ether body and astral projection of a person above the gray fog. Klein thought carefully as he tapped his glabella again while standing up. Chapter 99, Red Chimney. Late in the afternoon, Klein returned home and drew the curtains, allowing his room to slip into darkness. He took out his pen and paper and thought for a long time, finally writing down a sentence. The kidnapping of Elliot was due to extraordinary elements. As a seer, Klein had tried to divine if those coincidences were a consequence of unnatural developments, but the results showed otherwise. This time, he was influenced by Azik to look into these events again. He also drew lessons from the suited clown. He seriously designed an appropriate divination statement, eliminating any descriptions that might be vague or cause confusion. Yes, I should break down the 3 coincidences and divine them separately. Klein nodded in thought as he slowly removed the topaz from his wrist. He held the spirit pendulum with his left hand and allowed it to hang close over the divination statement on the paper. He collected himself and entered a state of cogitation. With his eyes closed, Klein started chanting repeatedly, the kidnapping of Elliot was due to extraordinary elements. As he recited the statement over and over again, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the pendulum, only to see the topaz turning counterclockwise slowly. It's still a negative, Klein muttered to himself. He designed several other divination statements, but the results persisted. There was nothing strange about that incident. He then separately divined the event of Ray Bieber's stay in Tingen and Selena's magic mirror divination incident, but the answers for both events were normal. Was I, a real seer, frightened by the charlatan Mr. Azik? Besides, Captain and the others didn't feel that anything was off. Klein laughed and shook his head, but he remained cautious. He planned on using the dream divination technique to get a final confirmation. After some thought, he changed the divination statement to fit the change in method. The true reason for Elliot's kidnapping. As he scribbled with the fountain pen, Klein paused and pondered over his words. After reading it over and over again, he tore the slip of paper and walked toward his bed. He relaxed and laid down. With the divination statement in hand, Klein quickly fell asleep with the help of cogitation. He found himself in a contorted, broken world. Regaining his senses, he began swimming through the blur. Gradually, he saw the few kidnappers. He saw them lose their final chip at a gambling table, saw them obtain guns from underground sources, and saw them survey the area. They even rented the apartment across Ray Bieber's apartment as their hideout. These didn't form a continuous scene. Instead, they were presented in the form of flashing pictures. Klein couldn't find anything that was abnormal. Furthermore, it had also aligned with the statements given by the kidnappers. After exiting the dream, Klein separately divined the other 2 incidents but had the same result. Their developments followed logic. The coincidences were really coincidences. I was indeed overthinking things. Mr. Azik is merely a divination enthusiast. Klein stabilized his pendulum and shook his head with a bitter smile. He was about to draw the curtains and allow sunlight into the room when he froze. From the original Klein's impression of Mr. Azik, he is a dependable and trustworthy person. He had never once said anything baseless. Even if he was always quarreling with Mentor, it was limited to academic topics, and each of them had their reasons. If he was truly a mere divination enthusiast, he wouldn't have interacted with me like that. And the memories of original Klein has nothing about him liking divination. Of course, this could be due to the loss of a corresponding memories. Klein frowned and couldn't ease his worries. He needed a way to confirm this. He suspected that Mr. Azik had unwittingly come across some insider information and was trying to remind him by using divination as an excuse. How should I confirm this? Klein paced back and forth across the dark room, trying to recall the other divination techniques he knew. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He suddenly halted as an idea came to him. Let's assume that these coincidences are dubious. I'm unable to divine a result either because my sequence isn't high enough or I'm being affected by outside interference, but I can change my environment. I can change my environment to someplace that is even more mysterious and even harder to understand. Klein felt pumped. He pulled open his drawer and took out a silver dagger. He concentrated and allowed his spirituality to flow out from the tip of the dagger, becoming one with his surroundings. With each step he took, the wall of spirituality sealed off the entire room. Klein planned on doing the divination above the gray fog, to do the divination in that mysterious world. In the magnificent ancient divine hall above the endless gray fog, Klein sat at the seat of honor on one end of the bronze table. Before him was a piece of goatskin he willed into existence. He lifted a pen and tried writing the divination statement as he had previously. The kidnapping of Elliot was due to extraordinary elements. He held the spirit pendulum and hung it low. Klein quickly composed himself as he turned silent and ethereal. Half closing his eyes, he recited the statement 7 times, using his spirituality to interact with the spiritual world that stood above all. Feeling the tug of the silver chain, Klein opened his eyes to look at the pendulum. The sight made him freeze immediately. The pendulum was spinning clockwise. This meant that there was an extraordinary element behind Elliot's kidnapping. This was completely different from the result he had gotten in the outside world. There were no traces of any interference. Such power or means is terrifying. What's the motive of the person behind this? Is my fate intertwined with the Antigonus family's diary? Klein was immensely shocked. He lost his calm and the rotation of the pendulum slipped into chaos. He put down the topaz and rubbed his glabella. His expression was abnormally grave. After contemplating for a few seconds, he didn't attempt to divine the other 2 events. Instead, he wrote a new divination statement, the true reason for Elliot's kidnapping. He held the paper in his hand and recited the statement 7 times. Klein leaned back and fell into sleep above the fog. Soon, he saw a boundless, illusory grayish-white fog. The fog dissipated slowly, revealing a colorful grass plain filled with flowers. The space behind the flowers and the plains was folding into itself, like a monster that had come alive. Klein tried his best to look forward, barely making out an image of a dark red chimney. At this point, the scene before him shattered, putting an end to his dream. Klein abruptly straightened his back in the majestic divine hall. His heart was beating wildly without reason. It felt like I had just spied on a terrifying thing. He took in 2 deep breaths to stabilize his chaotic emotions. Klein tapped on the side of the table sometime later and slipped into deep thought. Red chimney, garden, grass plains. How is this related to the person behind all of this? I cannot determine his motive from the coincidences, nor can I conclude that there is any evil intent. In the midst of this thinking, Klein felt alarmed, for himself, Captain, Fry, and the others. We are like puppets dancing on a string. What's even scarier is that we thought so highly of ourselves. I don't know how to raise this matter to Captain. Old Neil's divination produced the same results as mine in the outside world. If they asked me to confirm it in front of them, I have no way of doing that. Klein rubbed his temples as if he had a headache. After nearly 20 seconds of calm, he began divining the event of Ray Bieber's stay in Tingen. Similarly, he first used spirit dowsing. This time, Klein was shocked to see his topaz hang motionless. It was neither a confirmation or rejection of the statement. Strange, he muttered. He started to guess the reasons for this phenomenon. The person behind this has sensed my divinations and engaged in countermeasures? Following this, he tried the dream divination technique, but all he saw were fragmented pieces of fog. He no longer made any new discoveries. The results of Selena's magic mirror divination incident were the same. Klein could almost confirm his conjecture at this point. Since he had no way of notifying Captain Dunsmith for the time being, he had an unprecedented motivation to improve his abilities. I must head to the divination club later and quickly succeed in my acting to digest the seer potion. Also, I have to confirm whether the clown potion is indeed the subsequent sequence of seer, as well as gather clues about it. In addition, I have to interact more with Mr. Azik and see if I can dig up whatever inside information he holds. Klein held his forehead with his right palm and quickly drew up a plan and determined his focal point. After some thought, a goatskin appeared in front of him again. He picked up his pen and wrote, "The corresponding sequence 8 of sequence 9 seer is clown." From his prior experience, the present Klein was completely convinced that his divination abilities were augmented and enhanced above the gray fog. Just like how raids are usually successful, is this the result of having good luck? He muttered and picked up his spirit pendulum. Sometime later, Klein received a definitive answer. The corresponding sequence 8 of sequence 9 seer was clown. He then wrote on the paper once again. The corresponding sequences 8, 7, 6, and 5 of seer would grant at least one brand new, unrelated power. Klein exhaled as he tried spirit dowsing again. However, he saw the topaz hang motionlessly without any rotations. There isn't enough information to complete the divination and receive a revelation? He muttered to himself while seemingly deep in thought. Then, he set down the silver chain and began considering the required statement for a dream divination. Nearly 20 seconds later, he picked up his fountain pen and wrote seriously, "Clues to the clown potion." Chapter 100. Interpreting Symbols, Clues to the Clown Potion. On the seat of honor at the ancient bronze table, Klein repeated the divination statement a few times before leaning back and entering a deep sleep. His surroundings quickly became peaceful and quiet. He saw a hazy view, with countless distorted and blurry scenes flashing past, just like drops of morning dew on tender flower petals. Gradually, Klein grasped his spirituality and came to his senses. He saw a fireplace before him with a rocking chair in front of it. Sitting on it was an old woman dressed in black and white. Although he couldn't see her face since she was hanging her head low, Klein's gut feeling told him that she was an old lady. And he was pretty certain about it. The old lady was facing a desk directly. There were newspapers and tin cans inlaid with silver on the desk. Klein found the scene before his eyes very familiar, and he quickly recognized what he saw. This was where Ray Bieber and his mother stayed. This was where he saw a bloated cadaver for the first time. There are clues that point to the clown potion here? Just as Klein's thoughts flashed past, the scene around him transformed. It was a grayish-white warehouse, hidden among identical buildings. There were white bones scattered all around, and a few balls of flesh that looked like they had been squashed by a boulder. In the middle of the warehouse was a grayish-white object that was the size of a fist. Its surface was filled with ditches and it looked soft but ductile. It looked like a brain that had been extracted out of a living being. Just as Klein recognized the scene and recalled something, the scene before him distorted like rippling water before transforming into another new blurry scene. A naked body was laid on a long table covered with a white cloth. There were some bluish, discolored patches on the corpse's skin. Klein suddenly knitted his eyebrows and muttered, "It was first the images of Ray Bieber's hiding place and his remains, and now, it's related to the brand on the suited clown's wrist?" Just as he attempted to speculate what the scenes meant, the scene suddenly changed again. A marble coffee table, a set of 2 leather couches, and a chandelier that hung high on the ceiling. There were 3 people, Klein Moretti, who had black hair, brown eyes, and a scholarly temperament, a wealthy man with a chubby body and pale skin, and a beautiful young lady with fishnet gloves. Following that, it was another 3 people and an object. A middle-aged man in a black robe who had thick spiky brown hair, a wealthy man with a chubby body and pale skin, a half-century-old elder with messy eyebrows, thin brown hair, and gray-blue eyes, and a black notebook on the round table in between all of them, a notebook that exuded an ancient and distant air. The Antigonus family's notebook. Klein suddenly sat up straight and the dream vanished. Looking outside the divine hall where there was boundless gray fog and crimson stars, he thought in both shock and confusion. I was divining for clues to the clown potion. Why would the Antigonus family's notebook show up? Let me think, that chubby guy was Welch. Yes, Welch, an unfortunate fella who bought the Antigonus family's notebook and triggered a sequence of incidents. The beautiful young lady wearing fishnet gloves was Naya. I remember, the marble coffee table and leather couch combination is a hallmark of Welch's place. I saw spirit medium daily there. In other words, what I saw was Welch's living room. It was a scene where the original Klein and his two classmates were discussing the notebook. Klein calmed himself down and tapped on the edge of the long bronze table rhythmically. Then what does the last scene represent? The notebook appeared, Welch appeared. Could it be the scene where he bought the ancient item? There were another two people, and one of them looked very familiar. I feel like I've seen the middle-aged man in the classic black robe somewhere before. That spiky brown hair, severe dark eye circles. Yes, I know who is he now. Hans Vincent from the Divination Club, the Hans Vincent who died peacefully after Captain snuck into his dream, having learned that Selena secretly obtained the secret incantation from him. No way, he was the one that sold the notebook to Welch? Everything appears to be coming full circle. The world sure is small. No, Tingen is really small. On careful thought, it really is a possibility that Hans Vincent wasn't an ordinary fortune-teller. He was obviously deep into mysticism and obtained the attention of an ancient evil god. He had the channels, ability, and opportunity to acquire the notebook that was accidentally released by the secret order. It's no wonder Captain and company never figured out where Welch bought the notebook. Their investigative approach was entirely wrong. They had attempted to investigate via the antique market, but when the actual whereabouts of the notebook was found, they gave up on that lead. What a pity, Hans Vincent just passed away not too long ago. Otherwise, we definitely could have found out something regarding the notebook. Since he was involved in mysticism, he should have researched the notebook. His death was way too coincidental. However, there was another person at the scene, a man in his 50s. He might know quite a bit of what happened. Klein stopped tapping his fingers on the edge of the table and looked through every scene of his dream divination once more. Ray Bieber's house, Ray Bieber's hideout spot, the remains of Ray Bieber, the brand on the suited clown's wrist, Welch's house. Welch, Naya, and original Klein's exchange, Welch, Hans Vincent, and the Antigonus family notebooks group photo. Besides the brand on the suited clown, everything else is directly related to the Antigonus family's notebook. But I had divined for clues to the clown potion. This isn't scientific, nor does it make mystical sense. After becoming a seer, Klein once tried to divine where Welch had bought the Antigonus family's notebook, but he never considered using the unique qualities that the area above the gray fog possessed. As such, he had failed to receive any revelations, but now he had chanced upon the truth by divining something separate. After spending nearly 20 seconds to calm down, Klein summarized the context provided by Roselle's diary and attempted to interpret his dream divination. The first possibility, Zeratul, or should I say, the secret order, was searching and pursuing the relics of the Antigonus family. So, the symbolic meaning of the dream is to use matters related to the Antigonus family to lure the secret order into appearing, so as to obtain the clown potion's formula. The second possibility, the clown potion's formula is directly recorded in the Antigonus family's notebook. The fact that the Zeratul family is seeking the relics of the Antigonus family implies that they share very deep connections. They could have been allies or enemies. Hence, it seems fairly natural that the Antigonus family possessed parts of their sequence. Things would be obvious if they were allies, but enemies are the ones who would know each other the best. But the second explanation wouldn't be able to link it to the brand on the suited clown. Sigh, I do wish that the second explanation were true though. When the Holy Cathedral finds an expert to interpret the notebook, I would be able to obtain the clown potion without any risk. It seems that the first explanation is the most plausible. My gut feeling as a seer tells me that there might be a deeper symbolic meaning. Having thought of this, Klein massaged his forehead and suddenly realized the limitations of a seer. Unless it was a very simple and straightforward sign, a seer had to be extremely careful when making interpretations. It was just like walking on the edge of the abyss or walking on a thin layer of ice over a lake surface. The suited clown's outcome was an actual and bloody example of what a single mistake in interpretation or failure to grasp a key point could result in. In that instant, Klein had an illusion of himself mastering the true essence of a seer. He seemed to be just one step away from digesting the potion completely. "Thank you for enlightening me with your life. Praise the lady," he muttered and drew a crimson moon before his chest. Then he divined whether Azek had good intentions or if he was an amazing beyonder. He received confirmations for both of them. Eventually, the continuous divinations exhausted Klein. He had no choice but to stop churning through his thoughts and decide on the crucial matters that he needed to attend to. "I have to find the man that appeared in the same scene with Welch, Hannas Vincent, and the Antigonus family's notebook as soon as possible. I can begin my search with the Divination Club. I can't just confront Mr. Azek. Yes, he might be a mid-sequence beyonder of the life school of thought, but there's a lack of information, making it impossible for me to divine." Phew. Klein let out a breath and conjured the portrait of the half-century-old elder with messy eyebrows, thin brown hair, and gray-blue eyes on the goatskin that appeared before him. This was the third person present when the Antigonus family's notebook was traded between Welch and Hannas Vincent. Looking at the portrait, Klein suddenly fell into a dilemma. "I can't draw. During art class in primary school, I was always the one receiving the greatest criticism from the teachers. Should I use ritualistic magic like old Neil? This was done by praying to the goddess. If I were to use the uniqueness of the area above the gray fog, I would be in trouble if the divinities noticed something amiss. Hold on a second, perhaps I can pray to myself. Transmitting images and transmitting voices are similar. Although I'm temporarily unable to access the mysterious power above the gray fog, accomplishing such a minor matter shouldn't be a problem." Having thought of this, Klein immediately emanated his spirituality to envelop himself to stimulate the feeling of falling. Back in his bedroom, he lit the gas lamp and prayed, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. I pray for your revelation and pray that you allow me to draw what I've seen." After reciting the incantation, Klein didn't splash essential oils or burn any herbs to gain the help of their powers. It was just that informal when praying to oneself. There were suddenly murmurs in his ears as he saw the 4 black dots that formed a square surface on the back of his hand. He walked 4 steps counterclockwise and recited the incantation before penetrating the maniacal chaos to return to the area above the gray fog. This time he didn't see any of the crimson stars shrinking or expanding. But behind the seat of honor at the long bronze table, the strange symbol formed by a partial pupilless eye and partial contorted lines shimmered weakly as it produced illusory prayers. Klein held his ear to it and listened. After making sure that there were no mistakes, he conjured the portrait of its third person, and cast it towards the flowing light in accordance to the prayer's format. After everything was done, he immediately left the mysterious world above the gray fog and returned to his bedroom. Just as he found his footing, a portrait surfaced immediately in front of Klein's eyes. Furthermore, he sensed a weak and illusory power augmenting him. He picked up a fountain pen and found a piece of white paper and expressed his intent. Klein was surprised to find his right hand moving uncontrollably as it quickly drew lines. Before long, he saw a lifelike portrait of the third person. After writing down the hair and eye colors, as well as other unique characteristics, Klein heaved a sigh of relief despite the spasms of his right hand. The illusion before his eyes rapidly dissipated. Chapter 101. Unexpected Clue House Street, Divination Club. Klein pressed down on his half-top hat and walked along the stairway towards the main door. He wasn't dressed in his usual formal wear. Today, he was wearing a white shirt and a light-colored vest, paired with a thin black windbreaker, making him look more spirited than he had before. This set of clothing was more suitable for combat and had only cost him £1, including the fee for the small pocket that he had sewn into the vest. Compared to the suit he had purchased, it was so cheap that it brought tears to his eyes. He stroked the revolver in his holster, as well as the metal bottles in his tiny inner pocket. Klein then took out the portrait and entered the divination club. Without any surprise, he met the beautiful attendant, Angelica. "Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti. I thought you would come only a few days later." Angelica was taken aback at first before she immediately revealed a brilliant smile. Klein took off his hat and sighed. "Good afternoon, Miss Angelica. I had a dream at noon. I dreamed about Mr. Hans Vincent and matters regarding him. You know that, as a fortune teller, I absolutely cannot overlook any dream. It could be a revelation from the divine." Confused by his charlatan-like words, Angelica nodded in thought and asked out of curiosity, "What did you dream of?" "I saw Hans Vincent arguing with someone." Klein passed her the folded piece of paper in his hand. As Angelica unfolded the portrait, he pinched his glabella and observed the color of her emotions. This person, Angelica looked at the realistic portrait and slipped into deep thought. Klein saw her emotions turn into a thinking blue, a normal reaction. "This person," Angelica muttered once again. She slowly looked up and said, "I've met him before." Klein's mind whirled as he immediately asked, "When was it?" "I can't remember the exact date. Maybe a month ago? I saw him send Mr. Vincent to the door, and they were softly discussing something. I have a deep impression of him because of his thick and messy eyebrows, as well as Mr. Vincent's rare smile," Angelica described as she recalled. "Yes, he had a pair of grayish-blue eyes and, like most men his age, had little hair on his head." "Did you meet him again before or after that?" asked Klein gently. Angelica shook her head. "No, I am certain of that. I don't even know his name. To be honest, if it wasn't you, I would have suspected that any person showing me a portrait like this is a policeman investigating Mr. Vincent's death. I don't find it odd no matter what revelation you receive, for you are a true seer." "My apologies, I am a policeman," Klein retorted silently as he sighed and said, "A true seer would understand how minuscule he truly is compared to the vastness of fate. We can only see a hazy corner, forever receiving revelations, but never answers. We must reflect upon them constantly and keep up our respect and fear. We must decipher these hints with caution and not see ourselves as the intelligent ones who have taken control of fate." By summarizing what he had figured out over the past few weeks, Klein suddenly realized that his spirit vision turned clearer. He could even faintly make out the details within Angelica's aura. At that instant, he felt like a short-sighted man who was wearing glasses that suited him. Has my seer potion begun to produce clear signs of digestion?" Klein was stunned in disbelief. "I never imagined that a seer like you can still maintain such fear and respect towards fate." "It's truly admirable," said Angelica earnestly. She had seen too many people in the divination club who claimed to see through the truth and change fate after learning a few divination methods. Klein retracted his gaze and chuckled. "The more you know, the better you can understand how small we truly are." As he was saying this, he checked his body's condition and reflected on his past experiences. He could basically narrow the essence of the acting technique to actions corresponding to the name of the potion, understanding the hidden laws governing the role, as well as strictly abiding by these laws. Only by doing so could he change the state of his body, heart, and soul, making them closer to the remnant psyche in the potion, so as to gradually digest it. The acknowledgement of a seer's identity was only a factor on the surface. The reason why it made one's spirituality feel light had to do with how the feedback strengthened one's affirmation of particular divination actions. And these actions collectively formed the rules for digesting the seer potion. To help others interpret revelations and guide them in a better direction, yet constantly maintain one's fear and respect towards fate. One cannot be too egoistical, too proud, or blindly believe one's interpretations. These are the laws I can think of for the time being, as well as the essence of that acting technique that will guide me towards the future. If it continues to be this successful, I won't need half a year. Perhaps in 2 or 3 months, or even 2 to 3 weeks' time, I'll be ready to completely digest the potion. That sign was extremely obvious. It's no wonder the mysterious Mr. Zeratil said that the Beyonder will clearly sense it when the potion is fully digested. There's no need for anyone to teach them. It is what it is. Just like now, although my spirit vision has been enhanced a little, I know very well that this is only a pit stop in the digestion process and not the final destination. With this in mind, Klein couldn't help but thank the suited clown for teaching him with his life. If it wasn't for him, he would probably spend months at the divination club, summarizing the rules of a seer through numerous attempts, for better or for worse, before he began acting strictly. Mr. Moretti, I sometimes even think of you as a philosopher, Angelica said with a sigh upon hearing Klein's reply. In my circle of friends, the term philosopher is used to scold somebody. Klein was in a good mood. With that said, he bowed, wore his hat, and left after bidding farewell. Although Angelica was unaware of the gentleman's name or identity, Klein was in no way depressed. What he learned was sufficient enough for him to engage in the next phase of his plan. 36 Zutland Street. Inside Blackthorn Security Company. Dunn looked at the portrait in his hands with his deep gray eyes. You wish to carry out a search for this person? Yes. Klein had long prepared a reason for this. Captain, didn't I mention that I would head to the divination club to observe the reactions of its members on Hans Vincent's sudden death? I didn't discover anything yesterday, but I accidentally found out today that the person in the portrait had appeared with Hans Vincent once and was secretly discussing something with him. I flipped through our team's investigation report just now, but I didn't discover any person resembling him in the report. There were no loopholes in his description. Even if Dunn Smith were to take this portrait to the divination club, he would get the same answer from Angelica. Dunn cast his gaze away from the portrait and laughed. From the looks of it, the compensation funds weren't a waste. Captain, isn't your memory bad? Why would you mention the compensation at this point in time? Klein maintained a smile and didn't say a word. Was this drawn by you? Dunn asked in passing. Yes. I drew it with the help of ritualistic magic, Klein replied, completely honest. Of course, speaking the truth and revealing the whole truth were two different matters. Dunn nodded slightly and said, Get old Neil to make a few more sets. I'll get Kenley and Royale to investigate and seek the cooperation of the police department. If this clue is of any use, you would have contributed greatly once again. May Goddess bless us. Klein tapped 4 spots on his chest as he appeared abnormally devout. For him, all he needed from Dunn and Company was to figure out the name and identity of the man in the portrait. He could divine his location above the gray fog. Despite it being his day off, Klein didn't immediately return home after leaving the Blackthorn Security Company. Instead, he took the public carriage to the harbor and arrived in front of the Evil Dragon Bar's entrance. In his considerations, although a seer lacked the means to directly engage in combat with an enemy or the means to cast spells quickly, combat could be classified in many ways. Not all battles were chance encounters. As long as he had sufficient time to prepare, a seer could similarly deal with an enemy using ritualistic magic. It was exactly how he resolved the magic mirror divination incident at Selena's house. And this also meant that it was best if a seer brought along the essential oils, herbs, and tiny candles to avoid being in a situation where they were unavailable when they were needed most, thus resulting in a helpless death. After all, not everyone was like Selena, who had an entire assortment of mysticism items which could be used. As for the ones he applied for, as Klein had practiced frequently, he had used up most of them. He kept what was left in his tiny inner pocket. He patted the cash note in his pocket and pushed open Evil Dragon Bar's door and strode in. It was noon and there weren't many customers in the bar. Nor were there any rat baiting or boxing matches. It was quiet and not lively enough. Klein observed the guests drinking beer and playing cards as he walked toward the billiard room that led to the underground market. At that moment, he saw a muscular old man walk out with a torn admiral's jacket draped over his shoulders. Were you the friend old Neil brought last time? Reeking with the smell of alcohol, the blue-eyed, messy brown-haired elder sized up Klein and laughed. Klein guessed at his identity and took off his hat and bowed. Yes, how might I address you? Old Neil often mentions you. I'm the boss here, Swain. The blue-eyed elder's arms were thick and brawny. He had firm muscles and had the bearing of a military officer. Former Tingen-mandated Punisher captain. Rumor has it that he was once part of the Royal Navy. Klein replied politely, yes. If you're in need of money, feel free to approach me. Swain laughed as he mentioned before walking towards the bar counter. At that moment, Klein's heart stirred as he immediately shouted, "Wait a moment, Mr. Swain. I have something I would like to ask of you." Swain halted in his steps, turned halfway around, and said with a chuckle, "You look, well, very similar." "No, I'm not having memory issues." The corner of Klein's lips twitched as he pointed at the portrait he drew and asked, "Have you met this gentleman before?" He suddenly realized that Selina had likely been brought by Hans Vincent to the underground market. This resulted in Elizabeth's knowledge of the evil dragon bar as well. Then, could the man in the portrait who had some relationship with Hans Vincent have come here before? Swain took a careful look and replied affirmatively, "I remember him. He had asked me if I had documents or items related to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range." Documents and items related to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range? Klein was taken aback as he suddenly connected that to another matter. Back when he was borrowing the journal issue related to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range at Deweyville Library, the librarian had casually mentioned that someone had just returned it. Therefore, he still remembered very cleverly and didn't need to flip through his name cards to determine if the man existed. Could the gentleman who borrowed the journal issue before me be the one in the portrait? The gentleman that had witnessed the exchange of the Antigonus family's notebook. Chapter 102. Cloth merchant. The more Klein thought about it, the more likely it seemed. Otherwise, who would have borrowed those random journal issues for no reason? Yes, research regarding the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range is quite an unpopular field. Other than the corresponding lecturers and associate professors, the common hobbyist would have never heard of it. Even the original Klein, who was a history graduate, only knew about it from the Antigonus family's notebook. Although Tingen is a city of universities, there wouldn't be that many people who would be interested in the topic. And even if there is anyone interested, most of them would remain within the university's compounds. There would be no need to borrow the book from the Deweyville Library. The most important point is that the book happened to be borrowed only recently. By analyzing it this way, there really is a problem. I wasn't sharp enough and failed to realize it. Sigh, it looks like I have no talent at being a detective or acting like Sherlock Holmes. While these thoughts raced through his mind, the boss of Evil Dragon Bar, Swain, asked in puzzlement, "Is there a problem?" Since there were customers and bartenders around, he could only ask indirectly. "Nothing at all. I'm just wondering how I can investigate this gentleman. As you know, Hans Vincent died at his home." Klein had long prepared his excuse. He didn't want to make the mandated punishers become interested in the ancient relics from the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. Vincent was one of the rather famous fortune-tellers in Tingen City. He often came here. Swain had indeed given a perfunctory answer, but as he recalled, he said, "Now that I think about it, the gentleman in the portrait did come together with Vincent at the very beginning. That is exactly what I wanted to know. Do you remember his name?" Klein pressed immediately. Swain shook his head and chuckled. "I won't ask for my customers' names or identities unless I knew them to begin with, like old Neil." "All right then." Klein deliberately revealed a saddened look. To him, it didn't matter if Swain knew, because he could check the Deweyville Library. To borrow books from a privately funded library, he had to leave personal information, and his identification must have had sufficient credibility. After all, Klein had relied on an introduction letter from a senior associate professor before he obtained a library card. Even if the gentleman had forged his information, it is very likely that he left some clues which can be helpful to my divination. Klein watched Swain as he returned to the bar counter before entering the billiard room in deep thought. He wasn't in a hurry to head to the Deweyville Library for his investigations. He planned on completing his purchases first. After all, it was unknown if he would encounter danger and be required to use ritualistic magic for subsequent developments. After passing through a few rooms, Klein arrived at the underground market. There were a few stalls and customers, a clear indication that it wasn't peak hour yet. Just as he took a step forward, he suddenly saw the monster, Adamasol, who could smell the scent of death, standing in a corner. The young man was pale, and his eyes gave off a hint of terror and madness. He had also noticed Klein as he looked over. As they made eye contact, Adamasol suddenly extended his hands to cover his face. He moved toward the corner of the wall in a panicked state. Soon, he moved to a side door beside him and staggered as he ran out. "Is that necessary? I just nearly blinded you the last time. But I didn't do anything. Seriously, it's as if I'm the devil." Klein's facial expression was somewhat stiff. He shook his head and smiled. He stopped thinking about the monster and came to a stall. He started shopping with a goal in mind. After about half an hour, Klein spent a few pounds, which was most of his secret stash of money. He counted the 3 pounds and 17 soldi he had left, and he felt his heart ache. However, he touched the small metal bottle in the inner pocket of his black windbreaker. "This is the floral essence, amantha, which Madame Daly used previously. This is powder mixed with drago tree bark and leaves. Essential oil which is extracted from slumber flowers. Dried chamomile petals. This is holy night powder which I previously produced myself." Klein recalled the items stored in every tiny pocket of his and repeated them. He did it to prevent himself from failing to find the ingredient that he would need at a crucial moment. Relying on his unique traits in mysticism, he quickly finished memorizing them and walked toward the door. Suddenly, he saw a somewhat familiar figure in the corner of his eyes. It was a young lady in a casual green dress. Her smooth black hair was soft and glistening. She had a round face with long eyes. They gave her a sweet look and a refined bearing. "It's the girl who was shivering strangely on the public carriage? She does seem fine. I never expected her to be a mysticism enthusiast." Klein slowed down and thought for a few seconds before finally recalling who she was. He had to admit that, other than Justice, who he had never seen clearly, the young lady was the most beautiful girl he had seen ever since he transmigrated into this world. The sweet and refined girl stood before a stall that sold mysticism books and, in a breach of etiquette, kneeled to rub her fingers against an ancient book. The ancient book was bound with a black hardcover. The book cover had the words, "Book of Witches" in Hermes. It records the black magic of witches. Although I haven't dared to try them, someone I know did, and it really worked. The vendors seized the opportunity to promote the book. The beautiful lady thought and asked, "In your mind, what does a witch look like?" "A witch? A wicked person who brings calamities, disease, and pain," the vendor answered after some thought. Klein didn't hear their conversation because he had already quickly walked out the front entrance. He was rushing to the Deweyville Library in a hurry to settle everything before returning home to cook dinner for his brother and sister. Tomato oxtail soup was on the menu. Backlund. Crown Turf Club. Audrey Hall wore a long white dress with engagiantes and ruffled edges, as well as lace around her chest. She stood in a VIP room and watched the horses gallop. She wore a veiled hat decorated with blue ribbons and silk flowers, and a pair of light-colored fishnet gloves. Her cold and distant gaze seemed out of place in the bustling venue. Just as the racehorse breasted the tape, her friend Viscount Glaint came closer and said with a suppressed voice, "Audrey, every time I see you, you look beautiful from a different angle. How can I help you?" In the past, Audrey might have basked in the young man's compliment, but now she could see Glaint's ulterior motives through his speech and attitude. Due to the early passing of Glaint's father, he had inherited his title of nobility at the age of 20. He was a slightly skinny young man. He looked to the left and right, then chuckled softly as he said, "Audrey, I know a real Beyonder, a Beyonder that doesn't belong to the royal family. You've disappointed me every time you said that." Audrey looked forward and replied elegantly, "Really? I swear on my father's name. I have seen his Beyonder powers," Glaint replied with whisper. Audrey was no longer the same as before, in which should be excited over the news. She was now a Beyonder, but to prevent Glaint from turning suspicious, she widened her eyes and faked a surprised smile. She asked with her voice trembling, "When can I see him?" "Yes, it'd be great to meet other Beyonders. I can't just solve every triviality through the Tarot Club. Besides, I must gather my own resources to exchange them with Mr. Fool and Mr. Hanged Man. Not everything can be solved with money. Sigh, now that I've sent out the £1,000, I'll have to be more frugal." Glaint was very satisfied with Audrey's response. He looked towards the racecourse and said, "Tomorrow afternoon, there will be a literature and music salon at my place." Inside Deweyville Library, Klein took out his identity card and badge from his pocket and showed them to the few librarians. "I am a probationary inspector from the Special Operations Department of the Alwa County Police. I need your cooperation in an investigation," he said in a deep voice, recalling the police films that he used to watch. The librarians looked at the identity card and badge before exchanging looks and nodding at each other. "Go ahead and ask, officer." Klein recited the names of the journals like New Archaeology, and upon finishing, he said, "I want the borrowing records of the journal for the last 2 months. He realized that one of the librarians had attended to him before, but it was obvious that the man didn't recognize him. "All right, hold on a second." The librarian started searching and quickly found the recent borrowing records. Klein flipped through the records seriously, looking for the man who had borrowed the same journal as he did. There weren't many names since there was only one. He had borrowed the journal several times, including the issue that Klein knew of. The earliest entry was at the end of May, and the most recent one was last Saturday, a day before Hans Vincent's death. Klein ran his finger over the borrower's information and memorized it. Sirius Arapis, cloth merchant, residing at 19 House Street. Chapter 103. Doing as the heart willed, he resides at 19 House Street? Whilst memorizing the information, Klein keenly noticed a piece of information. Yes, Welch stayed on House Street. The Divination Club is on House Street. This cloth merchant named Sirius Arapis also lives on House Street. From the looks of it, it's nothing strange for Welch to know Hans Vincent either. They might have even gotten to know each through Sirius Arapis. Suddenly, Klein felt that he had linked the clues together as his thoughts turned clear. He was originally confused as to how Welch would be acquainted with Hans Vincent, since this son of a banker wasn't particularly interested in mysticism. To him, money was more important than divinations. But now, Klein felt that he had an inkling as to how they became acquainted. According to the descriptions of several magazines, middle-class and wealthy residents would gladly pay a visit to their neighbors from the same social class in order to form a social circle which is beneficial to them. Similarly, Welch and the cloth merchant, Sirius, absolutely have the motivation and opportunity to become friends since they both lived in the House Street vicinity. It isn't hard to understand how Sirius knew Hans Vincent, who regularly went to the Divination Club on House Street. Perhaps it was a coincidental meeting, or perhaps Hans had helped him out before. Regardless, this made it possible for the two of them, who frequently ran into each other within the same area, to become closer to one another. Hans Vincent wanted to sell his ancient books, and thus, Sirius introduced him to Welch, who was an undergraduate of the history department. In Hannah's dream, there was the figure of the suspected evil god, the true creator. He also knew of the proper incantation format. This proves that he was very deep into the realm of mysticism. The possibility that he might have even been a member of some secret organization cannot be dismissed. I cannot rule out the possibility of him joining some secret organization under Sirius's influence. With ideas coming to him so easily, Klein could tell that the information the man had left behind had a certain level of credibility without even using divination methods. Even if he isn't called Sirius Arapis, nor work as a cloth merchant, and doesn't live at 19 House Street, he definitely resides at House Street or, at the very least, somewhere nearby. While these ideas ran through his mind, Klein viewed the borrowing records once again with this new train of thought. The last time he came to Deweyville Library was last Saturday, a day before Selena's birthday party, which was also a day before Hans Vincent died. Several days have already passed since then, but he hasn't returned the issues that he borrowed. According to past records, if he only borrowed 2 issues, he would usually return them the next day. Could this mean that he knows of Hannah's death and was scared to the point that he no longer dares to come to the Deweyville Library again? Yes, he started by borrowing several unrelated history books and journals until he narrowed down what he needed, which is very similar to what I had read. This means that there was no one teaching him. There was no senior associate professor from the history department of a university. He did this completely through trial and error. What would a shocked target do? Two choices. 1. If he had all the necessary information, he would head straight to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. 2. If he still lacks information, he would lay low and observe the situation. He would only show himself again if he's certain that Hannah's death wouldn't implicate him. Having made this conclusion, Klein closed the borrowing records and returned them to the librarians. He then took out the portrait and asked if anyone had seen the man. Unfortunately, many people came to borrow books every day, and the librarians didn't have any impression of the average person. All right, thank you for your time. Klein put away his identification documents and his badge. He had no intention of continuing the investigation alone. This wasn't only dangerous, but also troublesome. He planned to head to Zutland Street once again and hand the case over to Captain and his teammates. He then planned to go home and prepare his tomato oxtail soup for his siblings before heading to the world above the gray fog to divine the target's whereabouts and condition. "Officer, is there anything else?" a librarian asked sincerely as he heaved a sigh of relief. Klein nodded slightly and asked, "No, I will come back if there are new clues." He held his black cane with his left hand and made his way to the door. At this moment, he saw a man enter the library with his head hung low. He was dressed in a double-breasted coat, its collars standing tall. When they walked past each other, Klein caught a glance of his thick, messy brows and his pair of grayish-blue eyes. These were things the tall collar couldn't hide. Serious? Serious Arapis? A coincidence? Klein froze. He didn't expect to meet his target here. What kind of luck was this? Wasn't this too much of a coincidence? He evaluated his physical condition and felt his aching sore muscles. Thus, he acted as though nothing had happened and continued walking towards the door. Well, we have to follow what our heart tells us. Safety matters. It doesn't matter if I miss this opportunity as long as Sirius is still in Tingen. At this moment, the man in the double-breasted coat arrived before the counter and was handing the journals to one of the librarians. "It's a return," he said with a soft, muffled tone. The librarian received the journals causally, and when he saw it, he suddenly froze. He subconsciously looked up indifferently as his body couldn't help but tremble. "Is there a problem?" the man asked in a deep voice. His question seemed like a spark that ignited a fuse, causing the librarian to instantly lose his self-control. He sprinted to the side and shouted, "Officer, the criminal is here." At this moment, Klein, who hadn't left the building, cursed madly in his heart. He instinctively reached for his holster with his right hand and drew his revolver. That man froze for a moment before turning and breaking into a sprint. But he didn't head for the door. Instead, he escaped in the direction of the oriel window to the side, as if he wanted to smash through the glass and jump out onto the street. Klein, who was flustered, turned his head to see the scene when he felt a sudden calm. He realized that even though he was afraid of the target, his target was more afraid of him. The man must be unable to determine my abilities in such an abrupt meeting. He isn't clear on what I am adept in, and so, he will instinctively avoid a direct confrontation and look for other ways to escape. Confident of his analysis, Klein lifted his revolver and pulled the trigger. At that moment, the man in the double-breasted coat abruptly rolled onto the ground in an attempt to avoid the bullet. Following up on that, he pressed down on the ground with his right hand and propelled himself into the air towards the oriel window. Click. Klein's first shot was empty. But this was something he had expected. He took advantage of Sirius's inability to dodge while in midair to aim at his torso and pulled the trigger. Bang! The silver demon hunting bullets tore through the air and penetrated straight through Sirius's back. Crash! The glass shattered and Sirius flew out the window, leaving drops of crimson blood on the crystalline glass fragments and windowsill. Klein was no longer afraid now that the target was injured. He ran over and jumped out the window with the help of a chair. This was the area lining the back of Deweyville Library's ground floor. A row of trees isolated a lush green field. The injured Sirius was running to the side, in an attempt to enter a small alley between two buildings. Having not practiced shooting at moving targets, Klein didn't dare to fire blindly. He could only carry his cane in one hand and his gun in the other as he pursued the man in a black coat. Tut, tut. He followed the trail of blood on the floor and tried to close the distance. With a corner coming up, the injured Sirius's speed became slower and slower. Klein, who had been waiting for an opportunity to capture him, suddenly felt a little afraid. He felt as though the man in front of him wasn't human, but a wolf or a tiger, one that harbored terrifying dangers. This was an instinct he had as a seer, and also a warning given to him by his spirituality. Klein immediately slowed down, his eyes scanning the blood on the ground. Compared to the blood he had seen earlier, Sirius's blood was now black. At this moment, a violent wind overwhelmed him. Sirius's face was reflected in Klein's eyes. Thick, messy brows. Grayish-blue eyes. Multiple protruding warts. An open mouth with 2 rows of white teeth. Sirius was launching a counterattack at this moment. This made the face reflected in Klein's eyes more visible. He could even smell a particularly putrid stench. Sirius pounced a distance of 7 or 8 meters, far more than any normal human being could jump. But as Klein had stopped chasing him just in time, there was still a distance of nearly 10 meters between them. When the distance was shortened to 2 meters, the sticky saliva caused by drool and the disgusting dense warts formed a harrowing scene that made Klein's nerves tense up. Without thinking, he seized the opportunity of the temporary immobility caused by Sirius's pounce to raise his right hand. He fired without stopping, allowing the bullets to rain down on the target's head. Bang, 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 bang. Shooting from such a close distance allowed the silver demon hunting bullets to drill through Sirius's head. Blood splattered everywhere as his face became more and more mangled, until he staggered backwards. Klein had emptied the bullets in his revolver in an instant. He subconsciously wanted to take a few steps back in order to confirm the results of this battle. But at this moment, Sirius gave Klein the shock of his life by trying his hardest to stand up straight. Klein abruptly lifted the cane in his left hand. Smith. The sturdy silver-inlaid black cane struck Sirius's neck, leaving a dark red mark. Smith. 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 Klein acted on instinct, raining blows on his opponent until Sirius collapsed, stumbling onto the ground. Puff, puff, puff. Klein supported himself with his cane and took deep breaths. His eyes were trained intently on his target, afraid that Sirius would suddenly jump back to life. At that moment, Sirius' head had basically been smashed into a pulp, and the warts gradually receded. His body stopped moving after a few convulsions. Klein was in no hurry to examine the corpse. Instead, he tossed his cane to the side and took out the demon-hunting bullets he had on him and reloaded his revolver. After doing this, he collected himself and fought back his disgust, kneeling down to search the pockets of Sirius's double-breasted coat. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.